while we're waiting, I'll actually use this opportunity to tell everybody here in the audience, welcome to the GAC webinar, and we would like your participation. It makes this process interesting and exciting for us and for you. So please use our chat to ask questions, discuss things with each other, but if you have questions for the panelists, please use our Q&A. It's a button on the bottom of your screen to ask your questions, and in the Q&A, you can upvote questions you think are interesting or make comments. Also, it's important in the chat. Normally, it will default to only messaging us in the panel, and we would like everyone to be able to see if you have some comment or suggestion or thought. So please make sure it says panelists and all attendees so that everybody can participate. All right, so let's begin. I'm just going to now introduce you. So welcome to the Cognitive Computational Neuroscience 2021 virtual conference. This year we have a series of keynote and tutorials, as well as the continuation of our generative adversarial collaborations. The generative adversarial collaborations were started last year, and we're going to tell you a little bit more about them in a second, and this is our first workshop for 2021. So the CCN Executive Committee, Thomas Nassler, Hendrik Newman, Russ Poldrak, and today as our backup is actually the communication, Kendrick Kay. This is the program committee for 2020-21, which was selecting the generative adversarial collaborations and organizing this virtual conference. Our program, as I said, includes these three components. Actually, the first component already happened. It was the Algonauts, a competition. So you can see that it'll be online and available for you to look at. Remaining in the conference this year are keynotes and tutorials, where we'll be discussing cutting edge ideas and presenting tutorials for you to work on. And today's program element, which is the generative adversarial collaborations. And here the goal is to find some controversy that is unresolved in the literature and to try to bring together people on both sides of this controversy to understand what the differences are and to potentially propose solutions. So this, the general adversarial collaborations, we think is a pretty unique contribution. It was started last year, as most of the conferences, as you know, had to be suspended, and we were looking for a way to do something that went beyond a standard conference. So what are they? Well, we know that we have a lot of predispositions in our scientific approach, and we often have hidden assumptions, things that aren't clear. When controversies come up between theory and experiment, between two theories or experimental results, we often just continue to try to demonstrate why we think our view is correct, rather than trying to come together and actually make sure we're asking the same question and trying to use the same approaches to solve that question. So what are we trying to do? We're bringing these researchers together. We want them to try to disambiguate theories in a fair way, and we want them to propose to find solutions to this. And we think that this is a healthy thing for neuroscience at large, because in the end, competition without collaboration produces a lot of non-productive science. And here, by bringing people together who can have disagreements, but to do it in a collaborative way, we really think we're going to move science forward. So we hope this was a benefit for you, and we hope that you will enjoy these generative adversarial collaborations. Today's collaboration is on the ventral stream and looking at ways we can understand it through blind and sighted individuals. There's going to be open public debates. There's going to be position papers. You can see the results of our 2020 projects. They have already put position papers up, and there's going to be a review of that, I think, in 2 weeks. We want to get community engagement. That's part of why we're doing this workshop today. So you're here, we would like your input, your thoughts. The panelists and the collaborators on this are interested in your feedback, and potentially if you have something to offer, you should try to get involved with them. Importantly, we think that these should ask important scientific questions. We had a large number of submissions, and we're selecting ones that we think are of general interest to the CCN community. But obviously, this is an idea we hope will take on and spread more broadly. And further, we want everything to be open. We're doing everything with open review. Everything should be completely transparent. So, the public materials for the 2020 GACs are available online. If you look at the gac.ccnneuro.org, look for the 2020 GACs. And we're going to be publishing these in the Neurons Behavior Data Analysis and Theory open access journal. Preprints are already there. So with that, this is the schedule of the current GAC workshops for the 2021, today's visual experience shaping the ventral stream. Then the next one is the progress report on the 16th for the 2020s. And then we'll have one on what constitutes understanding in the ventral pathway. And then how does the brain combine generative models and direct discriminative computations in higher level vision. And finally, a very interesting one on just what makes representations useful in the brain. That'll be on October 1st. So we also have keynotes and tutorials. Keynotes and tutorials are trying to introduce questions directly that we think are of interest to the community. Someone is saying there's freezing. Just raise your hand in the chat if anybody else is having problems. Looks good. Okay, good. These keynotes and tutorials are trying to bring together sort of new tools and new ideas that you might want to engage with. So this is ways that we can help bring things into the CCN community that may not be there. So this is another way we're trying to go beyond the traditional conferences. Again, we want the community to engage and propose these tutorials, and everything is transparent and diverse. This is the set of keynotes and tutorials. We have on the 13th, voxel-wise modeling. On the 14th, controversial stimuli, so how to optimize experiments using techniques that find stimuli that will help adjudicate between hypotheses. And then ways of flexibly identifying population dynamics from neural activity. That's on the 24th. So I hope you enjoy this year's CCN non-conference. Let's make it a success. And now I'm going to hand this GAC workshop over to the workshop host, Liz Saccone, who will take it from here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. Let me just share my screen. Let's see if this works. How are we looking? Good? Okay. Are we looking good? Can someone just let me know?
Yes, that's good.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. As Eric said, I'm Liz Saccone. I'm very fortunate enough to be a postdoc in Marina Bedny's lab. I joined about a year ago, and I'm really excited to be part of this workshop. So thank you to the organizers. I think it's great to talk about these issues in this sort of forum. So I'm going to start off today just by giving a bit of an overview of the theoretical space before we hear some more details about some relevant data. Oops, hang on. Okay. So I'll introduce the team. As I said, I'm a postdoc with Marina Bedny. We're at Johns Hopkins in the Neuroplasticity and Development Lab. We have Nancy Kanwisher and Apurva Ratan Murty from MIT. We have Olivier Collignon and Stefania Mattioni from University of Louvain in Belgium. And we have our resident computational modeling expert, Iiker Yildirim from Yale. So just to let everyone know, as I said, I'll do the introduction first, and then we'll have some data talks, then some discussion, Oh, I can hear someone's cat in the background. Then we'll hear from the senior thought leaders who will each give a brief overview of their perspective of the current state of the evidence, and then a discussion. And last, I'll open up the discussion on some experimental ideas and ways that we maybe can move forward on some of these issues. And there's more discussion time there. So the goals of the workshop, we want to lay out some alternative theoretical possibilities to explain the data and make some predictions of these views. We want to design some experiments to test these predictions. And really importantly, we want lots of discussion and feedback. So not just from the panelists, but also from the audience. So as Eric said, there's a Q&A function on these webinars, so please use them, and we'll try to incorporate as many questions as we can into the discussions. Okay, so what are we really interested in today? Today we're talking about this question, very broad question of how the human brain develops the way that it typically does. So specifically, how do both innate predispositions and experience interact to determine how our brains function? So this is a very difficult question to answer empirically. One way to look at this issue is by studying groups of people who have experienced the world in systematically different ways. So in this case, we're talking about people who were born with vision and people who were born blind. So here, what I mean by born blind, in this case, I'm talking about people who were born with a problem with their eyes rather than their brains. So compared to sighted, neurologically healthy people, these congenitally blind people represent a population with species typical innate predispositions, but atypical experience. So in the context of this broad question, I'm sure you can see how this special population can help provide us with some hints towards the answer. Now, this is not a large group of people in the world, but a number of labs around the world have been fortunate enough to study some of these individuals from a cognitive neuroscience perspective, and a number of those labs are represented in this GAP committee today. So at the most extreme oversimplified version of this issue, we could say that if innate constraints are the main driver of cortical function, then we should see mostly the same or similar functions in brain regions across these two groups. On the other end of things, if cortical function is modifiable by experience, then we should see some differences in brain function across sighted and congenitally blind people. So what do I mean by the same or similar function? You may have heard the term cross-modal plasticity. So in this sense, I mean, this is evidence of a preserved function or behavioral or cognitive role of a particular area of the brain, but using different information than what is the typical input modality. So a nice example of this, I think, is area HMT-B5, which in sighted people is thought to play a role in processing visual motion and spatial localization of objects around the perceiver using visual information. And in blind people, there's also evidence that this area does the same function, so it still processes motion and spatial localization, but instead using auditory information in people who are born blind rather than vision. On the other hand, we also have evidence in the visual cortices in blindness that there is a change in function in other areas. So for example, in V1, in sighted people, this is thought to process low-level visual information, whereas in blind people, there's evidence that it does a much higher level cognitive function, which is processing language. So with this background in mind, we're coming closer to the current controversy. So this controversy is really about the ventral occipitotemporal cortices, or the ventral visual stream, which in sighted people is thought to play a key role in perceiving and recognizing objects. And one hallmark of this area is particular locations of cortex that are functionally specialized for particular categories of visual objects. So, for example, we have faces that elicit stronger activation in the fusiform face area above other sorts of visual objects. We have evidence of a specialized area for perceiving places or scenes, the perihippocampal place area, and we have the visual word form area, which is thought to be a specialized area for processing letters and words over other objects. So the controversy starts to arise here because these areas in sighted people have typically been thought of as visual specialized areas. So I won't get too much into the details of the different theories about how these areas arise, but they are thought to be either a product of visual processing mechanisms or particular visual properties of these objects that correlate within a category and not across categories. The point is these were thought typically to be visual specialization areas. So now we have some evidence that similar areas may also exist in people born blind. So this casts doubt on this view and speaks to a very strong claim of innate predisposition. So just in a very brief overview, there's evidence that, for example, sounds related to faces and haptic information about faces elicits stronger activity in a similar area to the FFA, but in the blind cortex, above other categories of sounds and other types of haptic information. Similarly, we see effects for words describing places and sounds denoting scenes in the parahippocampal place area above other types of words and other types of sounds, and likewise for braille reading in a similar area to the VWFA. So I'm not going to go into detail about these findings because we're going to have some lovely data talks next from Ratan and Stefania. So, but the point is we have some evidence of this, of similar cross-category localization of these preferred responses. So one issue to resolve in this area is we feel that we need a lot more information about these regions in the blind cortex. So as I said, we have some evidence of these category preferences, but we don't really know that these areas are doing the same thing as they do in sighted people. In sighted people, they're thought to, broadly speaking, serve object perception, but do we know that these areas do the same thing in blind people? And we have no information or very little information on what type of features these areas represent in the blind cortex. So as a case in point, let's just take a minute to talk about the FFA and considering whether or not these areas are similar across blind and sighted people. First, we should talk about a little more detail about what these areas are thought to do in sighted people. So, I mean, there's hundreds or even thousands of papers on the FFA. So perhaps the idea of putting, summarizing it in one slide is laughable. And we have, we're very fortunate to have the world expert on the FFA, Nancy Kanwisher, here on the panel. So I'll be thrilled to hear anything she has to say. So this is very much just a snapshot of some views of what the FFA does. So if we can think about the signature of this area in sighted people, it's typically characterized by significantly stronger responses to visual faces over other visual object categories. So things like tools, houses, even scrambled versions of face images. In terms of the role of the FFA, again, certainly still debated, but one view is that it does detecting and perceiving faces. In terms of the features it represents, so what I mean by this is what is it about faces that this area is thought to respond to, or what is it about faces that that this area represents that's underlying the activity here. Again, certainly debated, but one view is that it's highly visual perceptual area, and that it's particularly representing the perceptual features of a face related to form. So, for example, the shape of the face, the size and shape of the eyes and nose and mouth, and the configuration of these features. That's one view of what features role represents. And more broadly, we can think about the domain of this area as being a social, animate, person-related domain. So what do we know about it in blind people? So as I said, we don't know that much. We have some evidence of a similar signature, which again, we're going to hear more about shortly, but in terms of what role it's playing in the blind cortex and the features it's representing, we really don't know a lot about that. So that's one issue that we'd like to work towards resolving to work out whether or not, or to what degree it's similar and different across blind and sighted VOTC. The second issue is that we don't know how this evidence of category-specific responses in the blind VOTC reconciles with other findings about blind occipital areas, which actually demonstrates that these regions can take on very different higher level cognitive functions, like language. So I'm going to present some more data on this a little later from the Bedny lab, but just as a brief snapshot, there's evidence that these VOTC areas in blind people can elicit separable responses to math and language, and also that for example, in this math responsive areas, we see evidence that it's sensitivity to algebraic complexity. So it is actually processing the mathematical content. Likewise, we have evidence that language responsive areas in the blind VOTC process this grammatical complexity of the language. So this evidence suggests that these areas are doing very different things in blind people to sighted people. So basically we have these two separate lines of research, one sort of investigating the similarities across the blind and sighted VOTC in terms of these category specific areas, and another line of research that suggests very different cognitive functions happening in the similar regions. So as yet, there's been no great attempt to reconcile these lines of research, but hopefully that we can start working towards that in the workshop today. So on these issues, we have two very broad competing hypotheses in terms of predictions. So one we're calling the similar representations view. So in line with a strong contribution of innate predispositions, one view is that these regions, the category specific regions in the blind VOTC would perform the same function and represent the same type of object features. So again, using the FFA as an example, we could predict that this region in the blind VOTC also has a face perception role and also represents the perceptual form related features of a face. On the other hand, we have what we're calling the related representations view. So if experience does modify cortical function, then we could see very different functions and different object features represented in this area. So what could this be? What could we predict under this second view? There's really very little that is off the table, I think, based on the current state of the evidence. And we're going to talk a lot more about this in part 3, certainly, in terms of talking about how we could move to resolving some of these issues. But just to give a bit of some examples, again, if we're talking about the FFA, we have evidence that face-specific activity is happening here, but we don't have evidence that it is only about faces. It could be anything to do with people, anything socially relevant at all. It could be about recognizing people and identities in a way that's not specific to faces. It could be something higher level about social judgments or judgments about people or emotional content. There's some evidence that I will review later suggesting that emotional content is represented in this area in the blind brain. And as I said, there's evidence of language being processed here, so that could be part of it as well. So I'm just going to leave these ideas here with a lot of question marks. And perhaps we can all have a bit of a think about that as this session progresses today, and we can talk about it more later. So that's it from me for the overview. So we'll hand it over to the data talks. So first we are hearing from Ratan. Thank you.
All right, can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you and see your slides.
Okay, perfect, thank you. All right, thank you, Liz. I think that was a great introduction. And my goal here is to briefly lay out some of our recent results on face selectivity in blind participants, so as to set a stage for a broader discussion later over the course of the GSE. And I have only 10 minutes, so let's just dive right in. Okay. So as most of you already know, and thanks to Liz's introduction, the ventral visual pathway in humans has a very stereotyped topographic organization, in that there are patches of the brain that respond to a single category of stimuli like faces, places, and bodies. But what is more impressive is that these regions are observed in almost all normal subjects, and they land in approximately the same location in the ventral visual pathway. And all of this just begs the question, how does this highly systematic organization arise in development? And today I will focus on the development of face selectivity in the fusiform gyrus. And this has been a notoriously difficult question, but I think work done on congenitally blind subjects has helped chip away at this problem in two important ways. And they help us address two big questions. And the first question is, what is the role of early visual experience? Is it really necessary in the causal sense for face selectivity to arise where it does? And I would argue that the experimental evidence on this has been somewhat mixed, as you can tell by just inspecting the titles of these two highly cited papers, one from monkeys and the other from humans. By the way, this is not to say that this is the only work looking at congenitally blind, but builds on an approach that is used by several others and compiled nicely in this particular review. Okay. And broadly, the second big question that I want to raise is what determines the location of these regions in the brain? Again, there have been several theories suggesting, for example, the importance of early foveal bias, pre-existing curvature bias, or perhaps connectivity fingerprint. But the approach that we took in our study was to scan congenitally blind people as they felt faces and other categories inside an fMRI scanner. And the reason we chose touch was because both vision and touch reveal the information about object shape. And in that sense, it felt that haptics might be perhaps stronger than audition. All right, so haptic scanning is quite different and exciting, to say the least. And it's because subjects lie inside an fMRI scanner with an MR-compatible turntable and 3D printed stimuli placed in front of them. Participants would extend their hands and explore the 3D printed objects. And these toys, 3D printed toys, were presented in a block design to both sighted participants as well as the blind participants. And the sighted participants did an additional task where they viewed visual animations of the same 3D printed images, stimuli, sorry. Okay, so what do we find? So here is the ventral view of the brains of 4 individual participants, 2 sighted, which are on the left-hand side, and 2 congenitally blind. And just to orient everybody, we expect the face selective activations to arise in the fusiform gyrus, lateral to this mid-fusiform sulcus, the part shown in the dotted line on the screen. But before addressing the question in blind participants, we first investigated what happens in sighted subjects during visual presentation of the same stimuli. And not surprisingly, we observed strong face selective activations in sighted participants. And this selectivity lands in the expected location, which is lateral to the mid-fusiform sulcus. But the real question is, what happens in blind subjects? Do they also show similar face selective activations while they were haptically exploring the 3D printed objects? But we see a strikingly similar pattern of face selective activations in congenitally blind. The activations also seem to land in a similar location as for the sighted subjects in the visual paradigm. And we observe this even across participants. We find that the face selective activations land in the approximate same location as sighted. By the way, this is not to say that there's no variability. And some congenitally blind subjects like this one shows no significant phase selective activations, and we don't really know why. And I hope this is something that we will explore later over the course of the GAC. But we wanted next to quantify these effects across the group. And in order to do this, we used a very standard procedure of identifying the phase selective boxes in a phase parcel based on half the data, while measuring the activations in an independent held out data set. Okay. And as before, we first looked at the cited subjects as the baseline, and not surprisingly, we find significantly higher response to phases, which are shown here as in the red bar, than the other object categories. But what about the blind subjects? We find actually a similar pattern. The mean activation for phases was significantly higher than the categories, than other categories, even across the entire group of participants. But do note that there was a difference in the overall magnitude of the response. So is visual experience necessary for phase selectivity to arise in the fusiform? Our results suggest no. But why does phase selectivity arise in that specific location in the fusiform genitals? We already know that it cannot be because of foveal bias, because these participants are blind and do not have a fovea. But what about curvature bias? So we explored this next in a follow-up experiment where we called a few of our blind subjects back for a second scanning session, where in addition to the four categories, we presented two additional stimuli, spheres, these kinds of things that are shown on the screen right now, and cubes. We then identified the phase selective boxes from the first scanning session and measured the activation on the second session. And this allowed us to replicate our effects, which we did, yay, but also evaluate the response to spheres and cubes, where we found actually no difference in response between spheres and cubes, suggesting that it isn't really curvature bias that's driving the difference in this particular region. All right, so what then could it be? So it's perhaps an amodal concept of a phase. And in order to test that, we actually ran the same auditory experiment done by Van der Herk and colleagues. So a big shout out to them for graciously providing the stimuli. And these included phase-related sounds. And I'm going to play the sounds, and I'm sorry if it was loud for you. So that's like a phase-related sound. And then there are object-related sounds, body-related sounds, and related sounds. All right, so as before, we at first identify and we observed actually phase selective activations even in that auditory paradigm. And as before, we first identified the phase selective boxes from the haptics experiment, from the touch experiment, to see whether the same boxes were also active in the auditory experiment. Okay, so and across subjects, we observed a strong phase selective activations even in the auditory condition, indicating that this region might be representing an amodal concept of the face in blind subjects. Okay, but we have still not addressed our question. Why does phase selective activation arise in that specific location? And I show here that this region responds selectively to phase-related sounds, which indicates that the representation in this region might be amodal and not strongly tied down to object shape. But what determines the locations of this region? We explored one more hypothesis. And this hypothesis was the hypothesis of long-range connectivity of this region with the other region. And this is broadly known as the connectivity hypothesis. And in its most basic version, the connectivity hypothesis states that the functionally distinct parts of the brain also have distinct profiles of connectivity. So those are known as connectivity fingerprints. And there is significant evidence that connectivity is super important from both human as well as animal models of but which I cannot get into right now. Okay, so based on all of this prior work, we asked whether connectivity fingerprints can explain the similar locus of phase selectivity in blind and sighted participants as in our data. And in order to do so, we employed a variant of this method by looking at what are called resting state functional correlations instead of diffusion imaging data, which is, I would say, an imperfect technique to infer connectivity. So instead of calling them connectivity profiles, I prefer to just call them as a correlation fingerprint. Okay, the first step in the process is to describe a region of interest. So which for us was this large region in the ventral temporal cortex that contains the fusiform gyrus and the other regions shown here in that white outline. And the next step is to determine how strong boxes in this region are connected to the other regions of the brain which were selected to be the target regions based on the human connectome project. And in order to determine the strength of the connections, we calculated the correlation of the resting state time course for each voxel in the region of interest and each of the 355 other target regions. And this is what we call the correlation fingerprint for each voxel. And the goal of this analysis is to build a model that learns a mapping between the correlation fingerprint on one hand and the pattern of functional activation, phase selective functional activation in the target region. Okay, so how well does this model do? So what we find is that the pattern of the functional pattern, that we can predict the functional pattern of phase selective activations in blind participants based on just the connectivity fingerprint if you took the connectivity fingerprint from the blind participants. But what was surprising that you could also predict the functional activation in blind participants if you took the pattern of connectivity from sighted participants. And that's what's shown here. And both of these were higher than a control effect based on a random effects group analysis. All right, I'm sorry for doing this really quickly because of time. All right, so the question that we asked here is, can correlation fingerprints really explain the similar locus of phase selectivity in blind and participants? And what I show here is that we can predict the location of phase selectivity in blind based on the connectivity pattern from sighted subjects. But can we do a little bit more? Can we also ask which connections are possibly important to get that prediction accuracy? All right, so we try to do that in the following way. And as I said before, all of these methods are imperfect, but we took a stab at this question by dividing the target locations into 4 lobes. Okay, so instead of having the entire, looking at the pattern of 355 regions, we just divided them into the 4 different lobes. And we wanted to see how well we can predict the pattern of functional activation based on the connectivity fingerprints from each of the 4 lobes. Okay, and as before, we can quantify the effects by measuring the model prediction accuracy, but this time we are restricting the target locations. And what we find in sighted subjects is that we can that the model still retains its predictive accuracy even when we restrict the data to within each of the 4 lobes. And in all 4 cases, the model predicts the functional data better than the group activation maps. But we see an interesting trend when we do this for blind subjects. And what we find is that the connectivity between the fusiform and the occipital and temporal regions are actually not predictive of the functional activation in that particular part of the brain. But the connectivity between the frontal and parietal regions is. So given all the disclaimers about resting state functional correlations, we still, we think that this data is suggestive that it's probably the top-down inputs from the frontal and parietal regions and not the bottom-up input from the occipital and temporal regions that might instruct the location of phase selectivity in blind participants. Okay, so at this point, I think I would quickly like to summarize. What I've shown you here is that we observe a robust pattern of phase selective activations in congenitally blind subjects. And both the haptic and an auditory paradigm actually activate similar regions in the fusiform. And that connectivity fingerprints can predict the functional activations in blind and sighted participants. And if there's a one-line summary,
just it seems your slide stopped advancing a couple of slides ago, so I don't know. Check and see whether. We're still moving.
I think Ratan's already done, so, or almost done. So, and I thought you were pretty clear, Ratan. So if you can figure out how to get your summary slide up, great. If not, don't worry about it. Just go ahead and finish, I think.
Okay, can you see my slides now again?
Yeah, that's great.
All right, I don't know what happened there. I'm sorry about that. Okay, but my summary slide here is that I think we observe a robust pattern of phase selective activations in sighted and blind participants. And the bottom line being that visual experience is not necessary for the development of phase selectivity in the human brain. And I would like to also take a minute to thank my collaborators on this particular project, Santani, David Beeler, Anna, and Ode Oliver. And in particular, I would like to give a shout out to Santani Teng, who was really helpful in this entire process. And of course, I would like to thank Nancy and Jim, who are my mentors here at MIT, members of my lab, and thank you all for your time. And I will leave you with this summary question. I think I'm already over there. Thank you.
There's just a quick question you might want to address because it's fast. Were the sounds presented to the sighted participants?
Not in this particular experiment, actually. We did not, we had only a few of the blind subjects come back for a second scanning session, but we did not present the, we have not done that experiment yet. That's a good question though, yeah.
But those sounds were presented to sighted people in the original Vanden Herk study, right?
That is right.
But that study didn't localize the FFA specifically, I believe.
Yeah, but it found a similar general location without.
Yes.
That's right.
Yes, yes, yes. So whoever asked that question, if you wanted to look up that study, is Vanden Herk 2017.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll put a link in the chat for that. Thank you, Ratan. That was awesome. Thank you so much. Stefania, would you like to go?
Yes, sure. So, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So that was a good question to have now because it's a nice transition because I actually did present sounds to blind, as you can see in the study I'm going to present. So I'm going to present our study that is published on eLife, and that is about the categorical representation from sound and sight in the VOTC of sighted and blind subjects. So we already heard a lot about the VOTC. This is a region that is known to be one of the main regions involved in the visual object categorization. And within this region, we find clusters of voxels that show selective preference for one of these categories when compared to the others. What drives this categorical organization? There are different hypotheses. One is that the low and mid-level visual properties of the stimuli are actually driving this categorical organization. Properties such as the eccentricity or the rectilinearity or the real world size. On the other hand, we have the opposite hypothesis that there are more high-level functions that are not purely visual that might drive this categorical organization. Something like the animacy or the categorical function itself. It is not easy, however, to test this second hypothesis because it is difficult to isolate the low and mid-level visual properties from the high-level function of this stimuli. This is because normally the stimuli share the low and the high properties within the same category. We thought that a good way to address this question, to test this hypothesis, was to present the stimuli not in the visual, but in the auditory modality, and to a group of people that are born blind. Our hypothesis was that if the categorical organization of VOTC is not based purely on visual processing, then we should find a similar organization also when the stimuli are presented as sounds, and even in people that never used vision functionally. To test this hypothesis, we included three groups in our study. A group of sighted subjects that performed the visual version of the experiment, 17 early blind that performed the auditory version of the experiment, and an additional group of sighted that also performed the auditory version of this experiment. We included 24 stimuli from animate and inanimate categories, including humans, animals, manipulable objects, and big objects and places. And each of these 4 categories was including 2 subcategories, as you can see in this slide. We presented these stimuli to our participants while they were lying in the fMRI, either in the visual or in the auditory format, according to the version of the experiment. And then we looked at the brain response to these stimuli with a special focus, of course, to VOTC. The first thing we wanted to look at was the topographical map of VOTC in the 3 groups to see if we could observe a similarity across the topographical maps in the three different groups. To do that, we assign to each voxel within VOTC one of these color according to which category that voxel was preferring compared to the other categories. So here we see the well-known topographical map for visual stimuli incited. The interesting thing is that we found the topographical map also for the auditory stimuli incited. And even though these clusters are not exactly overlapping with the one from the visual experiment, we found a highly significant similarity between these two maps. And this similarity was even more striking in case of early blindness. So here we see that there is a shared similarity between the topographical map of VOTC across the three groups. However, here we are looking at the VOTC globally, but I think it is interesting to zoom into one modality, so to be also in relation with what we just saw in the previous presentation. I zoom into the human category. In here we see in orange the outline of the face preference incited. And we clearly see that there is an overlap with the voice preference, both incited, that is in yellow, and in blind, that here is in blue. So I think this is also in support of what already Ratan showed, that there is not only a preference for a curvature or for the shape of the face, but there is something more, because in here we are looking at voice preference. So then to go back to the VOTC, we wanted to go more in deep and to look more in detail how these categories are represented in VOTC, and for instance, whether VOTC would be able to distinguish about our 8 subcategories. To address this question, we perform a more advanced fMRI multivariate technique. And basically we use the pairwise decoding, and we compare the pattern activity of every possible pair of subcategory. And in here, the gray column represents the ability of VOTC to distinguish these two categories. So higher is the column, higher is the ability. And with 8 subcategories, this means that we have 28 possible pairways. And then I repeated this analysis also in the early visual cortex as a region of control. Okay, the first thing I will show you is the average, the result, the average of these 28 values to look at the general ability of VOTC to distinguish these subcategories in the different groups. So let's start with the result from the visual experiment. In here you see that both, as expected, early visual cortex and VOTC can decode the different categories significantly better than chance. But the more interesting part was the auditory experiment. And here we see in orange the result from blind, and in blue the result from sighted. So first of all, we see that in the early visual cortex, this region only in the blind can decode the different categories better than chance, and also significantly better than sighted. But the focus of this study was VOTC, and in here we see 2 important things. First of all, this region can decode the different subcategories in the auditory modality significantly better than chance, both in blind and in sighted. However, we see that this ability is extended in case of blindness because we see that the decoding accuracy is significantly higher in blind than in the sighted. So what these data are telling us is that the categorical organization, the VOTC, is not only able to decode the different subcategories when they are presented visually in sighted, but also when they are presented in the auditory modality, both in blind and in sighted. Does this mean that the functional profile of VOTC is similar across the 3 groups? And first of all, what do I mean with functional profile? If we go back to the 28 binary decoding, we see that there are some categories that are better decoded than others. And we can consider this as a sort of functional profile of VOTC in each group. And we can also represent it in the format of dissimilarity matrix. And in here we have in yellow the results that high decoding accuracy results, basically categories that are easily decoded and that are different. And in blue, low decoding accuracy result, then categories that are difficult to decode, then that share a similar representation in the brain. And then to quantify this, how similar are these functional profile, we can use correlation. And if I plot these results, what we see here are again two important points. First of all the correlation values are significantly higher than 0, meaning that the three functional profiles share some similarities, significant similarities. But again, we see that the higher correlation is the one between the functional profile in audition in the blind and in vision for the sighted, suggesting again that there is an extension in the auditory functional profile of early blind compared to the sighted. In fact, this is significantly higher even compared to the correlation between the auditory and visual functional profile in the two groups of sighted, which is the orange column here. So we did further analysis in our eLife paper, and if you are interested in them, I suggest you to go and check this paper, but now I will not have time to describe them, so I will go to the discussion. What this study told us, what it shows is that the categorical representation that we find insighted for the visual stimuli in VOTC is at least partially preserved insighted when the stimuli are presented in auditory modality. And then this auditory categorical representation is even extended in case of early blindness. What I want to stress here is that we found it already incited. So what we believe is that what we see in the early blind is actually something that builds on what we see in sighted already. So if we agree on the fact that VOTC, it is not purely visual already incited, but that there is something more high level already incited, then speaking more in the framework of this workshop, I would say that our data are more in support of the similar representation view. And with this, I thank you for your attention and all the people that participate in this study, especially Olivier Collignon. Thanks.
Thank you, Stefania. That was awesome. That was really cool. I'd love to hear more about the voices part, but maybe we'll save that for a little later because we're already running a little behind, I think. So I'm going next to let me do this. Okay. I think I'm good. Someone interrupt me if they can't see. Oh, what about this? Let's get rid of that. Okay, I think I should be good. So thank you both, Ratan and Stefania. They were really cool talks. I'm going to now present some data from the Bedny lab that has investigated some very different functions of these regions in congenitally blind people. So there's quite a bit of evidence now showing that in early blindness, the occipital cortices take on higher cognitive functions, including language, math, and executive functioning. So I'm going to briefly present some findings from these three tasks. I'll go as quickly as I can because we're a bit behind. But first, I want to be very clear that I cannot take any credit for these data. I think these data were, the experiments were designed and the data collected by some of Marina's wonderful grad students and other lab members. So I cannot take credit, but I will give a brief summary. So firstly, we have some data from a language task. So participants, sighted and early congenitally blind participants listened to auditory sentences and also auditory lists of non-words as a control task. And just firstly, as an overview, here are the sort of regions that we see in blind more so than sighted. Occipital, I mean, this is a whole brain analysis, but the differences here we see are in the occipital areas, including the ventral, the VOTC, for sentences over non-words. Also in this task, there was a difficulty in manipulation. So sentences were either higher or lower in syntactic complexity. So in this complex syntax condition, we can see that the subject of the sentence, subjects of the sentence and the verb that it goes with are separated by this object clause in the middle. Whereas in the simple syntax condition, the subject here, which is the creator of the gritty HBO show, is right next to the verb that it goes with. So overall, these two sentences are very similar in the content words, the meaning, and the number of clauses, but here they differ in the syntactic complexity. And we see that regions of the VOTC in blindness show sensitivity to this manipulation. So here we have an ROI localized in Judy Kim's paper using a Braille reading task. So essentially it's the equivalent of what could be a blind VWFA. And this showed sensitivity to the syntactic complexity manipulation. And in the equivalent ROI in sighted people using a visual reading task did not. Likewise, we see this pattern in lots of other areas of the occipital cortices, as shown in Lane et al. 2015. And here we just have one example of V1, which showed this same pattern in the blind group, but not the sighted group. And just to let everyone know, in all the graphs I'm going to show in this section, the darker colored bars always represent the more complex or difficult conditions. So here we see that pattern of complexity. Second task is math. So in this task, participants listen to auditory math equations and also control sentences. So there were pairs of math equations. The task was to say whether X was the same in both of the pair, and also the auditory sentences were pairs of sentences as well. And again, it was the task was, is the meaning the same? And here I showed this earlier, but this is just a snapshot from the whole brain analysis showing in the ventral, in the VOTC, there are separable areas processing math over language and vice versa. So the math areas in red and the language areas in blue. And once again, there was a difficulty manipulation in this task. So there's two ways to increase difficulty of these sorts of equations. One is to increase the numbers. So there were single digit numbers versus double digit numbers. And the other way is to move the X around. So essentially the simple version is having the X on to the right of the equal sign on its own, or on the left. So again, the darker colors represent the more complex conditions. Here we have data from a control region where you can see in the IPS, both blind and sighted show this pattern of being sensitive to the algebraic complexity. So this is a math responsive ROI, but as with all the ROIs that I'm going to show, they were defined using independent data using the leave one run out procedure. And we can see that in a occipital ROI, we see the same pattern in the blind group, but not the sighted group. So the last task was a go, no go task. So it was a fast auditory task, and a tone was heard every 600 milliseconds, and participants had a little bit of training prior to fMRI. They learned that 2 of the tones were go tones, and one was heard more often than the other. So we have frequent go and infrequent go. And then we have one no-go tone. So this no-go was the most difficult condition, and the frequent go is the easiest. Again, here we have a control region in the right prefrontal cortex showing this pattern of complexity with higher responses to the most difficult condition in both sighted and blind. And here in an occipital ROI, we only see this pattern in the blind group. there were no significant differences across conditions in the sighted group. So here we have a snapshot of some data showing that occipital regions are sensitive to complexity across these higher cognitive functions. And I say we, even though I did nothing, we brought participants back so that now we have data for all 3 tasks in 22 congenitally blind people, as well as sighted controls. So here is putting it all together. You can see in the sighted group and blind group, and in the bottom row is the blind greater than sighted. You can see which regions respond preferentially to 1 task or 2 tasks. So mostly focusing on the bottom row here, we can see that various occipital, including VOTC areas, do respond mostly to 1 task only. There is 1 blob right on the far left. You can see a little bit of orange, which is responses to both math and go, no go. So there is a little bit of overlap there, but for the most part, separable regions. And we investigated this further by looking at task selective ROIs. So to see how specialized they were for each task. So again, we're using the leave one run out procedure. So here in this first ROI is the ROI that was the top 20 vertices showing the strongest effects for the go, no go task. So no go greater than frequent go. Again, the darker colors are the most complex conditions. So here we have the biggest effect in the go, no go task. Also, I should just say that we can't really compare across tasks in terms of the activation magnitude, because these tasks are all sort of separate. So I'm focusing really on the within task condition effects. So here we can see the large and typical go, no go effect where there's greatest activation for the most difficult task. There's small effects of language with greater responses to, in the middle, the blue bars, the sentences over non-words. And also you can see there's a small effect of the math complexity in the red bars. And so this is sort of consistent with what others have found for frontal executive control systems in sighted people. Next, we have the math selective ROI. So the most 20 vertices showing selectivity to math over language. So we have no language effect here really. In the blue, we have the expected math sensitivity. For the no-go, no-go, we do have this effect in the left hemisphere, but it's not the typical or expected effect with the greatest response to no-go. It's this bar in the middle is the infrequent go. So it's an interesting finding. And last, we have the language selective ROI. So the vertices that responded most for the sentences over non-words in the blue. So clearly we have the large sentence effect there in the blue bars. We do have sentences greater than math, which you can see on the far left. And again, there's some activation for the go, no go, but not the typical pattern with greater responses to no go. So putting it all together, we can see that data from these 3 tasks separately and also together show that for the most part, these cognitive functions are being performed in sort of separable regions in the occipital cortices of congenitally blind people and not sighted. So I hope that these data have convinced you at least for the need to consider this line of evidence alongside the evidence for category-specific responses. And hopefully we can find a way, or at least start to reconcile these 2 lines of research as part of this workshop. Okay, thank you. So, I mean, we're way over time, but we can, that's okay. We can, there's a couple of, well, there's some answered questions. I don't know if anyone who's answered questions thinks it's worthy of raising it to the group. If does anyone want to bring anything up, or Eric's just saying in the chat, if anyone from the audience can raise their hand, or we can review some of these answered questions, or does anyone have anything pressing that they think should be brought up? All right, we can review. Maybe we could just move forward. I think, okay, Nancy's nodding. All right, shall we move forward to the senior thought leaders? Marina, would you like to take the reins for a little bit?
Thanks, Liz. Although I balk at the senior thought leader title.
And a synonym for old fart.
No, it's a relative term.
I'll take old fart. Okay, so let me share my screen. And if someone can also please yell at me if I start talking too long, because I have a habit sometimes of doing that. So let's see. All right. So can you guys see my screen? It's probably a screen filled with people. So I first, before I get started, want to say a huge thank you to Liz, who has organized this whole thing and put together all the evidence and spoken to all the people and given us an opportunity to discuss together. Of course, I want to thank all the people in my lab, some of whom are pictured here, who helped me put together these ideas. I also want to say just what a lovely opportunity it is for me to talk to my absolutely favorite cognitive neuroscientists. So it's just this is basically trying to have conversations with people who I think are doing the absolute best work in this area. So it's an honor. Okay. So I'm going to try to, some of what I will say, I think will repeat some of the things that Liz has said and will say, but I think they are hard things. And so some of them are worth repeating. And some of the things I'll say are probably, or hopefully somewhat controversial and probably not believed by lots of people in the world, let alone including in my lab. So I'm just going to try to throw some ideas out there. So what I want to talk to you about today is the normal brain fallacy, right? And the question of the degree to which the human brain is hardwired and what we mean by that. Right, let's see. We're talking today about the ventral stream in people who are born blind, and asking the question of what these parts of the brain that we at some point believed were involved in visual recognition of particular categories of objects inside of people, what these parts of the brain do in people who are blind, like the fusiform face area, the parahippocampal place area, and the visual word form area. These brain regions that we thought were involved in visual recognition, what happens to them when they don't get their species typical experience? And I want to broaden out this question a little bit and ask the question of how special is blindness? So blindness is obviously special in that it is an unusual experience. We did not evolve to not have vision, but I want to ask, how special is it, right? So humans exist in all sorts of places in the world, in all sorts of environments, ranging from sitting at their desk at a computer for, some of my graduate students, maybe 12 hours a day, and coding, to, having political conversations around a table, to, hunter and gatherer societies, and arguably much of the way that many of us who are in the Zoom session spend our day is highly atypical from the perspective of an evolutionary environment, right? So it is not at all clear to me that my computer code loving graduate students are any more typical than people who are blind for the kinds of things that our brain evolved to do. And so the question at stake, I think, is the degree to which human brains adapt versus the degree to which they just do what they were built to do regardless of the place that they find themselves at. And so what I want to kind of bring in as just a theme for the way that I think about these things is the kinds of comments. So these ideas are not ideas that I've come up with. These are the kinds of things that anthropologists usually say. Neither psychologists nor neuroscientists tend to think about these sorts of things. But anthropologists tend to say that this notion of an everyman is probably not real, right? So that's what I think is at stake here when we talk about what happens to the brain in blindness, and particularly what happens to the ventral stream. What I think we've heard about today is some of the most exciting and best data on the ventral stream in blindness, right? So Ratan's study looking at responses to faces, I think in my opinion, the best evidence on face responses in blind individuals. Before that, there had been some attempts, but really no convincing evidence that there were face responses per se. So I think, here they are, right? The data are the data. And likewise, Stefania presented gorgeous evidence of dissociation between responses to sounds of animals and sounds of large objects in humans, in people who are blind and in people who are sighted. Again, I think these individuals like Stefania and Ratan are raising the bar on the quality of research in this area and really providing some real interesting ideas for us to discuss. And of course, Liz just talked about the fact that in parallel to these, to this evidence of functional preservation, we have evidence that, at least in principle, whether it's in the same exact regions or not, at least in principle, the visual system of blind people can assume functions that are very, very different from the things that it evolved for. And in particular, responses to higher cognitive information, including syntactic complexity and the complexity of math equations. And importantly, as Liz mentioned, some of these responses are in the ventral stream. And so Judy Kim in our laboratory showed that the so-called visual word form area, the part of the ventral stream that responds to letter forms and the forms of words, putatively inside of people, responds to the syntactic complexity of sentences in people who are blind. So the question is, what does this mean about the ventral stream? And so I'll give you my 2 cents for what I think might be going on. But what I mainly want to do is to claim that we know very little, is that hundreds and hundreds of studies have been done in sighted people asking these questions, really carefully characterizing what are the representations in this part of the brain. And still, we don't quite know what they are, but we have a lot of evidence. By contrast, in the case of blindness, we have just a few studies that give us some evidence. And there's a temptation to say that because under some set of conditions, there's a partial similarity between the response in the blind people and in sighted, that we've kind of solved the problem. And I think rather we have opened up new puzzles for us to study, and there's a lot more work that needs to be done. So what do we already know? So I do think that it is quite clear that the brain is not tabula rasa. If we needed to ask that question, studies of blind individuals really clearly answer it, as well as people who are sighted. People who are blind, like people who are sighted, within the visual system show similar responses across people, right? So we can do our usual, whole brain analysis, average things together, and we do get something, right? We get consistent responses. So we know that blind individuals have functional specialization in coherent locations, similar locations across individuals, just like sighted people do in this part of the brain. And that suggests that it's not random. I also think, like Stefania said, the evidence from blindness provides really strong evidence against the idea that all of the ventral stream specialization comes from these kind of low-level perceptual biases, like foveal versus peripheral, or round versus rectilinear, right? Trying to reduce these domain-specific responses to something very low level. I think the evidence we have from people who are blind already suggests that can't be right? Because otherwise, why would we get these dissociations in people who are blind? So there are strong innate constraints that systematize specialization across people, even people with different experiences, including people who are blind and sighted. However, do they make functions the same across people with different experiences? And I suggest, inspired by the idea that our brain is built not only to do particular things like recognize faces, but also to adapt and change according to our environment, that probably they don't. So what do we really know about the ventral stream in people who are blind? So I'm going to try to summarize some of the alternative ideas, and I think Liz will talk about this again, but I think it's worth rediscussing a few times. So what are the possible worlds that are, I think, currently consistent with the available data with regard to the function of the VWFA, the FFA, and the PPA in regions in the ventral stream? Do they represent the same content? So what I think we know is that these parts of the brain have potentially related functions across sighted and blind people, but exactly how they are related and why, I think, remains an open question. And I think this is where maybe computational approaches could facilitate getting some answers. But in particular, what I think we need to know is what is the representational content and behavioral role of these brain areas, not just whether they respond to a particular domain. So for example, one possible world is that these regions are involved in recognition of form/spatial information in sighted people and in blind people. So maybe in blind people that respond to like tactile input, but the content of the representations, so it's a distance between the eyes and the configuration of facial features, that representation stays the same across these populations. It's just that in people who are blind, the input is tactile, and in people who are sighted, the input is visual, and maybe auditory input kind of partly activates that information. That to me would be, a pretty hardwired view. It's not a completely hardwired view because the input modality changes, but it's pretty hardwired. A related idea is that actually in people who are sighted, these regions are also not visual. I think some of the evidence from sighted people, at least in the case of the FFA, and I'm looking forward to hearing what Nancy has to say about this, is not super consistent with this idea that they're not visual in anyone. But I think it's possible, it's logically possible that these regions are the same, but we shouldn't assume so. So another possibility is that the ventral stream responds to similar domains across blind and sighted people and is involved in a similar behavioral role, namely recognition of objects like people and words and places, not strictly an object, but based on different information, let's say acoustic features. So the content of the representations are different, but the behavioral role is similar and the domain is similar. That's a possible world that we have not ruled out. Another possible world, which I kind of lean to these days, is that the responses are to similar domains, but actually the representations are quite different. So for example, in the case of the VWFA, in both blind and sighted, the responses are related to language. But in the case of the blind participants, they represent high-level syntax, abstract linguistic information, whereas in the case of sighted people, they represent visual representations of word forms. Quite different. Likewise, in the case of the FFA, it could be that these representations represent higher order social information or maybe emotional information in people who are blind, but visual information of form in people who are sighted. I think this possibility is equally on the table along with the two above. And finally, in a slightly deflationary note, I do think it's still possible that in some cases, the representations appear to be related, but aren't. So for example, a study that Liz will discuss in some detail suggests that the FFA responds very strongly to verbal information in people who are blind. It also cares about the emotional valence of that verbal information. But it is still possible that, a common innate blueprint ultimately leads to functionally very different profiles, even cognitively non-related profiles across these populations, with language responses in people who are blind and facial recognition responses in people who are sighted. I think we just don't have enough evidence to rule out, to take anything fully off the table. That is my opinion. And so I guess what I would like to say is that we should humble ourselves in the face of lack of evidence and persevere and not jump to the conclusion that what the brain does in people who are sighted is the normal and necessary pattern. So I think part of what this is about is assuming that the sighted brain is kind of the standard brain, or that the brain, the way it functions in us, this is part of like the problem of doing work on blindness as a sighted researcher, that the difficulty that I face, that we all face, which is understanding what is ecologically valid for this group of people, and not assuming that the way our brain characterized has been, as we've studied it, is the normal pattern. And so the question is, does the brain adapt to our ecological niche as we find it as individuals? And that's it.
Do we want to take questions from Marina, or shall I just wait? Am I next? I forget.
I think you're next. I think we should keep moving. Personally, I think we should keep moving because we're already way over.
Okay. Okay, are you guys seeing my title slide? Okay.
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. Well, this is really fun. Thanks so much to Liz and everyone else for organizing this event and including me in it. So what I'd like to do is there'll be some overlap, but I'm going to bring in some other literatures that I think are relevant to this big question of what the blind brain can teach us about typical development. And specifically, what I think the blind brain can tell us about one of the most fundamental questions in cognitive neuroscience. It's already been alluded to here, but how does the functional organization of the typical mind and brain, if there is such a thing, Marina, arise in development, and what is the role of experience in that process? And of course, as others have noted, a great venue for this discussion is the ventral visual pathway. And that's a great place to ask this question of what, if any, visual experience is necessary for these regions to develop. And I want to start by saying that for one of these regions, we have a big piece of the answer already, and that is the visual word form area. And so we know that the visual word form area responds much more to visually presented words and letter strings. That's the purple bar here in this study, compared to lots of other kinds of visual stimuli. And Zeynep Sagan showed a long time ago in a longitudinal study in which he scanned the same kids across ages, that if you find a little bit of their brain at age 8 after they learn to read that responds selectively to words, and align it to the same kid's brain at age 5 before they learn to read, and ask, what is that bit of brain doing before the kid learns to read? Answer, it's not selective for visually presented words or letter strings. And so that shows that people don't have a VWFA until they learn to read. Further, we know from work of Chris Baker and Jia Liu and others that the VWFA in sighted subjects responds only to orthographies a subject knows. Okay, that's further evidence that it depends on the specific experience of that individual. And finally, Martha Farah and colleagues have been making the argument for a very long time that reading is a very recent invention. We haven't been doing it as humans long enough for natural selection to have crafted specific neural circuitry dedicated to that task alone. Putting all these things together, I think the evidence is really overwhelming that the selectivity of this region, at least in sighted subjects, depends on that person's individual experience. And so the question I want to raise is, well, what about all of these other regions? Do they require visual experience to take on their typical selective function, like the visual word form area, or might some of that arise without visual experience? Okay, so for all these other reasons, it's harder to catch the state of the thing before the relevant experience. The VWFA is unusual that way because the relevant training doesn't happen until later. However, the amazing Heather Kosakowski, working with the also amazing Rebecca Sachs, have been working for many years in figuring out how to scan very young infants. And amazingly, they have shown the existence of face, place, and body selective regions in infants aged 5 to 9 months. And you see that here in group analyses, but you can also see it in proper functionally defined region of interest analyses where the held out data show very clearly higher responses in the lateral fusiform to faces than to each of these other stimulus categories, similarly for the PPA and the EBA. And so, wow, that is early, that is amazing, that is cool. But of course, even by 6 months, infants have had lots of visual experience. So how can we tell if the visual experience is required for that development? Well, one way, aside from blindness, is controlled rearing. And I love this method. I don't do it, but I'm jealous of those who do. I think it's very, very powerful. And I want to bring up a study from way back. Sugita raised baby monkeys without ever letting them see faces. And he showed, I'll skip the details here, but he showed that on the very first test using selective looking and habituation, that those monkeys who had never seen faces before were extremely good at discriminating individual faces, all of which suggests that much of face perception is present without any exposure to faces. Well, that's a behavioral study. What about the brain? This brings us to another landmark controlled rearing study, Arcaro et al. 2017. This paper's already been alluded to, but just let me show you a little bit of the data. So these guys also raised baby monkeys without ever letting them see faces. They had other visual experience, auditory experience, cuddling by human caregivers who had welding masks over their faces. So they had lots of other experience, just never saw faces. Here is a normally reared baby monkey at 250 days of age, showing you in a flattened cortex, those yellow spots, which are the face selective patches in a typical young monkey. And what these guys showed is the face deprived monkeys did not show those face selective patches at all. Okay, really important study. Implies, as they argued in their title, that seeing faces is necessary for face domain formation. My response to that is, wow, awesome. Hats off to you guys. But really? What about the Sugita behavioral findings? What about humans? And in fact, around the same time, another paper, which has already come up, Vanden Hurk et al., showed, here's the data that were being mentioned, that red stuff in the lateral fusiform, this is in sighted controls showing you face selective responses to visual stimuli. Here's the auditory data in blind subjects showing you very similar activations to the auditory stimuli. And Stefania also mentioned similar data from her lab, all of which suggests that visual experience might not be required. And indeed, as you've already heard from Ratan, he also finds selective activation in that same region for touching faces in congenitally blind subjects. So, which further suggests that visual experience with faces is not necessary for development of face selective responses in the fusiform. So what I want to do in closing is just to highlight a bunch of questions for discussion. First of all, how can we reconcile Ratan's data and the similar data from Optebeck and Vanden Hurk and Stefania and Olivier with the data from the face-deprived monkeys? What is up with that? I want to mention that these two sets of findings are not necessarily inconsistent. We don't know whether those face-deprived monkeys might show auditory or tactile responses to face-related sounds or touching faces. I kind of doubt they would, but we don't know. Also, blindness is a very different experiential manipulation from face deprivation. And so that's also not an inconsistency and may explain part of the discrepancy. My personal hunch is that the crux of the difference is that when blind subjects hear voices or feel 3D printed faces, they know that's a face. And when those face-deprived monkeys see a visual pattern, it's just a visual pattern. They have no idea what it means. I think that's got to be part of the answer. Second question, but who knows? Second question, why is activation present in not all of the congenitally blind participants, at least in Ratan's study? It was over half, but not way over half. Some of them just didn't show it at all. The ones that did, it was crystal clear. The ones who didn't, just didn't. And so my hunch is that there's something task dependent about that activation. And that just pushes the question back to what task is it that some of the subjects were doing when they were feeling those faces and others maybe were not. Closely related to that, what is the blind FFA, in quotes, doing? What is the mental process that's being invoked that activation reflects? I don't think it's face discrimination. This is not something that blind people do very much. And I just think it's unlikely that there's a patch of cortex sitting there throughout the life of a blind person that waits, most of the time with no activation. And then after years goes, wow, there's my stimulant. I'm exaggerating. They can feel their own face, right? But that responds to this very rarely experienced stimulus. So that raises the question, what are they thinking when they feel faces? I don't know. We didn't get much out of them by asking. We tried. I think theory of mind is unlikely. Feeling a little plastic face, you could be thinking about what is that little piece of plastic thinking, but it just seems a little far-fetched. And Marina has some data on that. Maybe we can get her to talk about it. We can get kind of feeble clues from some other activations. In Ratan's study, there were some weak, we don't know how strong they were, but there were hints of activations in the STS, anterior temporal lobes, and VMPFC, all of which suggest something social-ish. And what about that does that region that Ratan finds, does it overlap with that language versus math activation in the Congenital study right there? It looks pretty similar. I'd love to know if that's the same region. And that's really important for knowing what this region is predisposed for, right? So importantly, we shouldn't think of blind, I'm almost done. We shouldn't think of blind activations as showing us, the real function of that region without visual experience, what's present at birth. Because of course, as Marina mentioned, blindness is one kind of developmental trajectory. And then there are probably multiple other developmental trajectories. And so we have to reason back from these two end states to what was the common predisposition. And that's a fascinating but difficult question. And finally, as Ratan briefly mentioned, how does this face selectivity know where to arise in development? And my guess, based on his data and lots of other people's data, is that it's long-range connectivity present at birth that really tells that little patch of cortex what function to take on. And I hope I didn't go way over, but I will shut up now.
Thank you, Nancy. That was wonderful. I loved it. I mean, we're behind, but does anyone want to pipe in and say anything? Because so far we've had two very smart women make two very some very interesting points. So I'm not sure if anyone wants to jump in and say anything more. All right, let's just keep moving then. Olivier, take it away.
Okay, do you see the slide?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Now, thank you very much. It's very exciting, really. I think also it gives a very nice and strong message probably to the younger also in the audience that we can disagree, right? So I love the idea that we can disagree in a friendly way. We can debate, discuss. I think without that, we will not make progress. So I'm really, really happy to be here with also people that I admire the work. So yeah, a privilege again. So yeah, the debate has been outlined already, right? So the idea is that if we have to binarize, as we like to do, whether the VOTC in blind people adopt a distant function, right, than the one this is implemented in sighted subject, or whether it keeps something similar to the organization we know VOTC is implementing in sighted people, right? So that has been said before, but so that where does that bring us? Oops. Here is that we need to understand actually whether the system changed or maintained its function. And actually, it might be much less trivial than it looks like. And I'll outline only 2 points that I want to make today. There are many more, right? But they've been raised before. It's that first, we need to conceive VOTC as an information processing system. And I'll explain what I mean by that. And 2 is that probably there is already more in VOTC than meet the eyes also in sighted people, right? So when we will define distance in blind people, we will need to keep that in mind, whether the VOTC in sighted people is only visual, and we have already seen that probably it's not the case, right? So if we take the first point, like conceiving VOTC as an information processing system, right? So if we think about like foundation of cognitive science, and when we think about this, right, obviously you cannot do that without citing Mars, that obviously is very influential for people working in the field of vision and probably in computational vision, where he outlined 3 levels, right, of how to understand how a system works, right? Any kind of systems. And if you kind of transfer this tripartite way of looking at a system to the brain, right, he outlined there is a computational level, right? So what does that mean? A computational level, in his words, it's what is the goal of the region? What is the role of the region? What is the region doing in terms of input to output transfer, right? Then there is the representational or algorithmic role. What is the format of the representation that is manipulated and how this information is manipulated? There are many ways, right? Information can be manipulated. And then the implementational, which is like somehow like the hardwire, like somehow like, oh, is it physically imprinted in the brain? I'll not touch at the 3rd level, but the 2 first levels are very interesting, I think, because they are always mixed when we speak about cross-modal plasticity in blind people. What I do believe personally is that the computational level is preserved. So basically the region keeps its goal. And I really don't know, and somehow to some extent, it's not really important as a first start, at least, whether the exact representation or the algorithm is perfectly the same, right? So my point here is that probably the region keeps a role that is similar to the one that is implemented in the sighted brain, but maybe, like Marina's outlined, using a different format of information processing, might be tactile, might be auditory, might somehow slightly change the way it operates on this function, but the goal of the region is maintained. This is my view. So let me take an example. For example, it's controversial, it's meant to be so. So Marina showed very nicely that the region in the dorsal occipital cortex prefers maths than language, right? And she concluded widely that this region can adopt a widely different cognitive function. So we have done more or less at the same time, actually, a study investigating arithmetic processing, and we arrived to the conclusion that occipital region for higher cognitive operation might not differ significantly from the original function, right? And emerge from intrinsic computational bias. So how can we, using the same topic, arrive to so different conclusions, right? So how we did that in all cases that we saw that subtraction, for example, in terms of arithmetic processing, involves an operation that is specific. Like, for example, it involves spatial processing. It has been like demonstrated. I don't extend too much on that. Whereas multiplication adopt a different type of cognitive process to solve the operation, mainly fact retrieval. Right. So if we contrast, I'll not go too much into the detail, these 2 things, what we see actually is that only in blind people, so if I contrast what is more activated in blind versus sighted people. So first, what we see is that there are separate networks for subtraction and multiplication, as has been shown, for example, by Manuel Piazza and others. And what we see is that occipital cortex of blind subject is recruited only for subtraction, right? And in a very specific region. Where is this specific region? First, they very nicely shared the data with us, actually. It overlapped with the region Congenital, also Marina showed before. And it also overlapped with a region, because we did a previous study on that, that involves into auditory spatial processing, right? So there's kind of an overlap in this region, which is a region in the right dorsal stream, right? That is involved in specifically subtraction, the type of operation Marina used in her study, specifically more than for multiplication, which involves also processing symbolic number and doing arithmetic, and it overlaps with spatial processing. So my take here, and this is purely hypothetical, is that this region actually, its main role is to process spatial relationship between items, whatever these items are, physical or conceptual, right? And therefore this region activates when blind people do a subtraction operation. Does not mean, to me, if this is true, and I'm not sure it's true, but if it's true, that means that this region actually may maintain its function, because behind this higher level process, that is subtraction, there is obviously a series of operations behind that. Some of them are pretty low level, like spatial relationships. And the second point I want to make is that, again, there is more in the occipital cortex than meets the eye. So basically, that there is actually we all know that there is a hierarchical processing, right? And we already know with processing visual input that at one point of the visual hierarchy, right, VOTC is kind of insensitive to the visual look of objects, right? It will cluster objects together that have the same function. Like, for example, it has been demonstrated for animals here. But if you think about view invariance or these kind of abstract processing we have to do with images, right? We obviously know that there is necessarily in VOTC a kind of abstraction from the low-level visual input, because how would we recognize a cup in different orientation, or a face even in different orientation? And we do so, we activate this region, even though it has not the same visual input. Stefania has shown that it's also there incited for auditory information, right? This is the most important point here, I think, is that the relationship between vision and audition is not only here in sighted people, in blind people, sorry, but also here in sighted people. Right? And if you think about face, we just discussed about face. So Stefania showed that actually even in sighted people, this is here, this is FFA, right? The outline of FFA defined visually in a separate group of visual people, of sighted people, sorry. And we see that voice specifically recruit regions that partially overlap with this network, also in sighted people, right? And obviously also in blind people. And actually, maybe this is not that surprising, because again, this is a study in sighted people. And they have like different computational models. They show a various series of faces to people here, right? And they create different models by asking people to evaluate these faces about the low-level relationship of faces look alike versus their social relationship, the attractiveness, the valence, the perceived trustworthiness, right? So they have different models that are either low level or high level. And they separate OFA and FFA, and they show that in OFA, some low level features best explain the activity in this region, whereas in FFA, socially relevant information, perceived similarity and social traits actually explain best the activity in these regions, right? Clearly, something that is higher level than the separation between the eyes, or this kind of somehow relational, physical distance between some features in the face. And actually this study, I find it pretty interesting also, right, by the group of Fries, that they show that if you just take abstract shape like true triangles, and then you make them interact like if they were socially interacting, right? You see also activity in FFA, right? So they suggested in this paper that the function of the core system area for face perception, however, appears to extend beyond face processing to a more general and abstract role in social cognition and perception of others, right? So there are already suggestions out there that what we think are visual regions, right, are conceived as visual regions, might be actually implementing at least partially, not only, but at least partially higher level process. And if we believe in that, therefore, maybe this relates to what we see in blind people. So I'll skip that. And for language, just like because it has been mentioned also, I think there's also evidence that VWFA is not only sensitive to printed forms. At least there is a portion of VWFA, probably the more anterior portion of VWFA, that actually also react more to spoken language, right? In listen and speak condition, obviously read and write, that is expected, compared to a control condition, right? They have a control condition. So it seems that already in the sighted brain, right, VWFA, or at least a portion of VWFA, maybe the anterior portion of it, might do more than just being sensitive to printed form. right, which may relate to actually the selectivity that very nicely Marina and her group showed. So just to conclude, I think that if we think about these things I've outlined, when we look at the cross-modal plasticity, the typical reflex is to see the nurture, right? Because obviously, dramatic change of experience, when you contrast anything the blind do with the sighted, they activate the occipital cortex more, so there is reorganization. Obviously, there is reorganization. But maybe behind this reorganization, right, there is a scaffolding, right, that is there that impose a way of processing information. And again, I'll switch back to what I say. We need to agree on what we mean by processing information, right? At least at which level of information processing we are referring to. And I finish here.
Thank you, Olivier. That was amazing as well. Oh my gosh, my head's spinning. Does anyone want to say anything? Does anyone have any comments, or anyone from the panel want to say anything before we hand the floor to Ilker? I'm just worried we're going to get to the end of this session and there's going to be so many things to talk about that we can't talk about anything. No? Okay. Ilker, take it away then.
Just setting up. And is that working? Can you guys?
Yeah.
Looks good.
Yeah.
All right, cool. I can't see. Okay, all right. I think that will be fine. Yeah, hi everyone. I think I'm hoping my talk will detail some of the issues Olivier raised. I was also thinking to myself, how do you give a talk after 3 actual top leaders? But we will see how that will go. I want to thank Liz and Marina, who took the charge organizing this workshop. My name is Iiker Yildirim, and I'll tell you about using causal generative models to explore representations across trajectories of typical and atypical sensory experience. But before I do that, I want to first give a quick introduction to what my lab does, in part because we are a new lab and not a lot of people know what we do, but also an equal part, I think our group is a little bit of an outlier in the context of this workshop. We are not really an imaging lab, nor we have ever worked with the blind population, nor any other atypical populations. So what do we do, and why it is relevant for in the context of this workshop? We are primarily a computational lab, and our work cuts at this intersection of computation, cognition, and neuroscience. And in our models, we aim to address constraints which sometimes appear conflicting, arising from each of these perspectives that would then allow us to link activity in neural populations to percepts and thoughts, to our mental lives, cutting across levels of analysis from cognition to neurons. Inspired by this conference series, we call this the CCN challenge, and we come to it primarily from the perspective of cognition, thinking deeply about representations. And often in our modeling work, we start close to cognition and then make our way toward the center where the golden star is. The primary objective thing that we are interested in is to answer, how does perception get us to cognition? That is, when we open our eyes, we don't just see jumble of light or colorful patterns, but instead we see objects, surfaces, agents, and their multiplied interactions. We wish to understand a very basic aspect of our experience. How is it that perception transforms raw sense inputs, whether it is touch, audition, or vision arising from our physical environments, into things like objects and people, into things that we can think about. To do so, we'll look at this whole scope in the context of behavior and neural implementation, from perception to cognition, from how we see objects and their compositions to scenes, their dynamics, which is forces and what they can do, and how we can make plans and goals with them. So what does it all have to do with the controversy of this workshop? So our charge in part today was to think about the similar versus related hypotheses. And as I understand, it is a controversy very much grounded in neuropsychological perspective. That is, pick a brain region, say in the visual cortex, and see the extent to which its function and representational contents are preserved across different trajectories of sensory experiences. Before I go on to talking about how we think about this problem, I have to note the caveat that Marina have also raised, which is that we don't have much data in this area. And that's one reason, that would be consequential for this issue. And that's one reason I'm excited about this workshop, that will generate much of such needed data. And what I will do in the rest of this talk is I'll present a computational framework that helps us define representational and functional hypotheses about specific brain regions and brain hierarchies. And I'm gonna also argue for both the similar representations view as well as this related hypothesis, not because I want to be risk averse or boring, but because I believe really that is the most honest thing I can say at this stage based on what we understand of the computational basis of perception and cognition. So I'll try to bring in a computational perspective where these two hypotheses will sort of mark the extremes or at least certain distinct points on a continuum. The starting point for this computational framework is twofold. First is that the contents of perception are so much richer than what traditional or dominant theories of perception suggest. Perception is not just about pattern recognition as an image classification or person identity recognition. For example, consider this computer animated face. It is someone you can't have familiarity with. Most of you probably haven't seen it before, but as you are watching it, you can see the momentary details of its three-dimensional shape and texture, the subtleties of expression, and even some visual cues to help. Similarly, in the video that I showed before, the child needs to know about the detailed shapes and sizes of his objects, whether they fit and whether they can support a stable structure. So any computational theory must account for the fact that perception is so rich. And at the same time, much of what we know of the world in terms of higher level perception, these rich representations I was just talking about are, by and large, not tied to any particular sense modality. What do I mean by that? I have been talking about objects and people, and indeed, when we think about other people, which consists of face cognition and person cognition, we perceive many physical and social qualities that are modality independent, including the shape of a face, how far a person is, sort of a scene configuration and composition, how many people there are in a conversation, their head directions, whether they are young or old, our familiarity with them, and in certain, and their goals, how they are feeling. We can see these qualities for sure with vision, but we can also hear them, and in certain cases also feel them. Similarly, in object cognition, we can see as well as feel, often just as effectively, the shape of an object, how heavy it might be. We can hear the room geometry or navigable surfaces. When it comes to flexible manipulation, it demands rich physics-based object representations, as in pouring water from a container to a glass, placing my plates in a stable manner on the table. These cognitions are operational whether sighted or not, although empirical data would help here, for example, to study intuitive physical reasoning in the visually impaired populations. So how can that be? How is it that we can perceive the world, the structure in the world, so richly in terms of objects and people, in terms of their physical and social qualities? And these abstract model representations can be computed from a multitude of sense modalities. In our work, we have been developing such a computational framework, mostly in the domain of vision, which is how I will expose it here, and use this computational framework to understand how can perception be so rich and yet be computed from sense inputs. The framework itself is based on an old idea. It is sometimes called as analysis by synthesis or perception as unconscious inference, and it is about causal reasoning. There's the causes out there in the world, lights, materials, and objects. And if you have a model of how the world works, then the causal processes by which the world gives rise to sense data, like how the light bounces off surfaces, that's optics or graphics, we can then work backward from images, like a kind of a deductive work to go back to causes. This is also called as inverse optics or inverse graphics. But causal generative models are not only about vision, nor they are only about perception or aesthetic scenes. They are more general than that. They are also about reasoning about physics of objects. And these things can facilitate planning and goals. Now, this approach is promising, but the problem is that it is very cognitive. Traditionally, analysis by synthesis has been considered as a nice cognitive idea with likely none or very little bearing when it comes to understanding neural computation. And that's in part because mechanistic implementations of these approaches have been really slow and purely top-down, in a lot of ways in stark contrast to the known dynamics of information processing in the brain. In our recent work, we have shown that these drawbacks can be addressed. And once this is done, this approach has a lot of promise in terms of reverse engineering neural computation. We have shown that if you take a causal generative model, like what I am showing here, this is in the context of face perception, it's arrows going from a 3D scene to an image, we can reverse these arrows by building an inference network. Now, this network goes back from images to their underlying 3D scene representation. We refer to this model as efficient inverse graphics network. And this network is trained based on paired samples of images and their underlying 3D scene parameters, all drawn from the generative model without requiring any outside supervision. The core thing that matters here is that this model implements the analysis by synthesis hypothesis. It says that the goal of sensory processing is to infer the underlying causal scene structure. And we have extensively compared this model to standard approach using, at the time, the state-of-the-art, really powerful deep neural network, the VGG network, where the outputs are sparse labels of person identities, ignoring this intermediate causal structure. We have tested these models in the context of macaque face pack system, which you might be familiar from the works of Doris Sau and Winnick Freiwald, based on single-cell unit recordings across multiple brain regions. And although I'll not go into details, we found that analysis by synthesis explains a lot of the qualitative patterns in the neural data, and does so in a quantitatively superior manner relative to the alternative models. Now, this is just one study, but we and others are finding similar results in multiple stimulus domains. And the key import, I believe, the studies afford are that they help us first define representational and functional hypotheses about brain regions with concrete computational models. And two, it establishes this neurocomputational idea that the targets of perception are not arbitrary categorical labels, but instead are not merely arbitrary categorical labels, but instead it is about building internal models of the outside world by making inferences about their underlying causal structure. That brings me to the sort of the key hypothesis that I think can be of help in the context of this workshop. And that is to say that similar representations in the brain regions should be observed across the typical and atypical sensory trajectories to the extent that the cognition relevant causal variables are shared across sense modalities. What do I mean by that? I think it is not a stretch to say that in the context of object cognition and scene perception, many causal variables must be shared. Those that enable physical reasoning, flexible manipulation, planning, and navigation, and that those suggest similar representations across the structures responsible for these functions, such as part of the scene network, including the OPA, structures such as LOC, as well as parietal regions that are implicated in things like intuitive physics. And I think, to a certain extent, this is consistent with some of the perspective we are, and the data we have been seeing so far across the talks. And I've explored such cross-model correspondence a while back when I was in grad school in the specific context of object-shaped perception. And I've also done some of this with faces, modeling cross-model face recognition. This study is very preliminary, especially in the way it can relate to neural implementation, but it is also limited in another important way. As Nancy's eloquently put it, it is fairly uncommon for a blind individual to sense a face by touch. And it's really where the similar hypothesis starts to become a bit untenable. And even in the purely visual case, if you take the generative model I showed earlier and generalize it to be a physical 3D head model, it would still be operating in the sort of, certain face cognition abilities, seeing the 3D scene, how it is composed and all that. But as I noted earlier, we also want to think about faces in the broader context of person cognition. And I want to illustrate that using this, this short excerpt from a video clip, where they brought together two people, 57 years apart in age, and then had them ask each other about becoming old. I'll let you watch it. It's great.
Like, I can't bend down against the floor. Well, I can still do that, but the problem is your body gets a bit stiff.
What I'm gonna now do is that I'm gonna play the rest of this clip, but this time you will only hear the conversation.
Your body gets a bit stiff. That's right, yes. You might get sick more often. Hopefully you don't. That's the problem. It's pretty bad.
Now, I hope you can appreciate that the shapes of the faces are gone entirely in this audio on the clip, but the richness of your experience remains intact. You know how many people there are in the conversation, and if you were present in the studio, you would know where they are, what direction they are headed, you would know how old they are, and it is a little emotionally charged also. That, I think, forces us to think about these generative models in the actual complexity as we find them in the real world. The 3D head model is only part of it when it comes to person cognition. We want to also think about goals, emotions, context, familiarity. I'm putting all of these into a box for simplification. Certainly there are intermediate stages if you want to implement a full model, and certainly lateral arrows between these variables. And I think that would be an exacting patient thesis to work out. But I'm making a simplification here just to convey the idea, which is that these causal states can be observed through multiple sense modalities. But in the specific case of person cognition, much of the head model, especially the parts of it that are information intensive, such as shape, texture, or expression, without vision, they can be, in effect, pruned or de-emphasized quite a bit. We need to revise our causal model of the world, as certain aspects of it cannot be or are simply not sensed. And this would suggest a related representation view where parts of the cited FFA that compute these representations should give way to other causal variables and be driven by other sense modalities.
Iiker, just 1 second. Some people were asking if you could just summarize the audio and the video because it was a little hard for some people.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's important.
Let me just conclude, and then I can go back to the audio and the video because I'm realizing I'm running over time as well. All right. Sorry about that. I thought I optimized for video, but likely I actually forgot to do that. So let me just summarize, and then I can go back to fleshing out the point that I wanted to make in that video. But that's all I got really. And what I did is I told you about this perspective that perception is about reversing causal generative models of the world. And that's actually neurally important idea. It has neurocomputational implications. And we would expect similar representations only to the extent that the relevant cognition-relevant causal variables are maintained across sense modalities. We'd be delighted to be part of data collection here, And I believe implementing these causal models that fully engages at the interface of physical and social worlds can help reveal the nature and origins of mental representations. All right, so that's all. I can, yeah, I mean, so if, maybe what I can do about the audio is I can post the YouTube link for everyone to view the video. It's a hilarious as well as sort of a little emotionally charged kind of a video with some bits of Irish wisdom. But the point I really wanted to make is when I turn off, sorry, I did not mean to play it actually, but when I turn off the the visual input, the audio stream just endangers this rich experience of a scene that individuals, having this, like the rich, content that you have of the scene configuration and the youth and the old. So a lot of that seems to, operate in the absence of vision, and that motivates thinking about what might be modified, what are those things, internal representations that must be different between, or that must adapt in light of, atypical sensory experience. And I think, this could, implemented models of this sort could lead to, concrete ideas in terms of what we should expect in terms of, remaining similar and what we should expect to get modified. All right, I'll end here.
Thank you, Ilker. That was awesome. Yeah, perhaps if you could post the YouTube link in the chat. I'm going to suggest we take a quick break. Eric called it a personal break. I'm calling it a loo break. So if Ilker could post the link, and then we can all have a look and take a quick break and come back in maybe 5 minutes. And then I'd love to hear some panel members talk about some of these things, because I think everyone raised some really interesting ideas, and I for one would love to hear some discussion on it. So let's meet back in about 5 minutes. Okay, some of us are back. I'm not sure if everyone is, or people are still coming. Would anyone like to start some discussion on? We just had 4 pretty great talks. I'm not sure where to start personally.
I mean, I can say something just because, just to, start us off in the discussion. And actually, so I'll share my screen while we were chatting. I made this little thing, which is like lumping versus splitting, right? So, based on Ilker's talk, I think it is doubtless that people who are blind and people who are sighted have sensory differences, not conceptual ones, right? And there's lots of evidence for that we all get the same information, like person identity, emotion, mentalizing. But I guess the question is, how is it implemented in cortical tissue, right? So there's no doubt that, both a blind person and a sighted person has to have a causal model that goes from sensory information to conceptual representations. The question is, how is it? And I guess like what I would like to just raise to some of the things that have been said is, if we say that what is happening in the visual cortex of blind and sighted people in the ventral stream is the same, what are we giving up in terms of splitting in other domains, right? So, when we look at numerical representations in people who are sighted, they are typically distinguished not only from visual representations in those same people, They do not depend on the visual system, but also from spatial representations and representations of grasping and representations of pointing and various kinds of representations, right? So we discussed a little bit about like subtraction versus multiplication, and I agree with Olivier that those are known to activate different regions. But I think one of the reasons is that multiplication depends on memorization and subtraction is actually calculation rather than memorization. I don't know that that means that subtraction is spatial, right? Or that even saying that it's spatial would localize it to some particular part of visual cortex. Likewise, in the case of the FFA, in sighted people, we like to think that it's different from this very important network studied by Rebecca Sachs and many other people, namely a socializing network, which in fact includes subregions involved in emotional processing and identity processing and theory of mind processing, from regions involved in recognizing the faces of people. And so the question I have is, if we're going to lump, are we going to give up on this distinction inside of people? Likewise, in the case of language, right? There's lots of levels of representation in the sighted brain that we like to distinguish, right? The, let's say, posterior portions of the VWFA, right, in the ventral stream that supposedly respond to word forms from, syntactic representations in Broca's area, let's say. So unless we're willing to kind of just collapse all these distinctions in the sighted brain, I'm not really sure why we would do so in the brains of people who are blind. So I'd like to hear thoughts about that.
I'll take a step. I think I'm not sure. I understand the lumping perspective, but I'll just say, from the viewpoint of causal generative models, I mean, hierarchy is everywhere. Right? You want to have hierarchy, you want to have structure. You don't want to really, both, we talk about in the computational and, modeling world in terms of probabilistic programming, there's this idea of domain-specific languages. So when you want to operate in a certain, domain of perception, for example, just let's not even, go to this top level of, language versus vision. Let's just remain within vision. All right, and let's consider, two domains of vision that are, studied on their own terms, face perception and body perception. And just really in terms of seeing the, the identity, the 3D shape, whatever you might compute along the strictly ventral stream hierarchy within the 150 milliseconds of processing or so. The best models we have that can explain the activity in the context of macaque, neural recordings are models that make domain-specific assumptions. They actually distinguish a generative model for bodies from a in terms of their posture and shape and articulation from faces in terms of their head expressions and texture. So I think, the lumping perspective seems like, tabula rasa. Like I feel like it is a very, if the idea is, there's, a very empiricist version of, what might be happening in the brain. You get the sense inputs and you learn associations, based on the principles of resemblance and co-occurrence. All right, so this is Locke and all the British empiricists. If that's the view of how the mind develops, I think it is not implausible that you might get a lumping and jumble of everything all together, like in a very unstructured, ball of weird connections. But if we think about the mind as building a model of the world, I think domain specificity is unavoidable, because that is, from at least engineering perspective, we know that is the best way in which we can describe the world. So it's a cultural, perspective, to the extent that engineering takes advantage of the structure in the world and cares about efficiency, it's a, making domains and operating in domain-specific ways is a good design to have also in the brain.
Can I just add to that? Yeah, I love that. Of course, I love that point, Ilker. But some recent work from Katerina Dobbs, I think, underlines those benefits really strikingly. So what she's been doing is training deep neural networks on both face recognition and object recognition. And what you find is that they do really well at, your standard VGG or whatever it is. They do really well at both. But then if you look inside and you say, okay, how is that thing organized? You find that it has spontaneously segregated itself into two processing streams, one for faces and one for objects. And that's cool. It suggests that actually there really is a general computational reason why brains do this. I mean, arguably, it seems like maybe brains do that for the same reason. It makes computational sense. And the deep nets just kind of figure this out on their own. But it also is kind of interesting in terms of thinking about development. Of course, deep nets and the way they learn, develop is just radically different from brains. But it says that at least for one case, you don't need to actually build in anything domain specific to get any domain specific prior structure to get domain specific machinery out, right? Because there's nothing about that deep neural network. It's just generic VGG trained on a bunch of visual categories. You don't tell it treat these faces differently than these objects, and it figures that out and does. And so to me, that says in principle, it's possible for domain specific organization to arise without domain specific priors. Doesn't say that's what happened in human brains, but in principle, it's possible.
So I just wanted to quickly distinguish between what kind of lumping where we could be referring to. So I think what I consider Ilker and you, Nancy, right now to be talking about is the potential for lumping in the horizontal plane, namely domains of information, maybe at the same level of representation. But I think in addition to that, which I think there's lots of evidence that there's heterogeneity. We don't totally know where it arises. I think the blind data lean to ideas that they arise from higher cognitive sorts of biases, but yeah. But then what I mean by lumping in the vertical plane is the difference between syntactic trees and the forms of letters, the difference between emotion representations, representations of mental states, for example, and representations of faces, the difference between the representation of conceptual distinctions like artifact versus natural kind, right?
Okay.
Versus perceptual distinction. So what I'm saying is, if we want to say that a blind person's representation of syntax is the same that a sighted person's representations of a word form, then what are we giving up in the sighted brain, right? So that's really what I mean. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. And I think just to add one little piece of that, to me, my read of the literature is it's pretty clear. Not everyone believes this, but I think it's pretty clear that the ventral visual pathway in sighted humans is really doing perceptual analyses. Yeah, you can classify animals and tools, you can classify all this stuff. It's doing visual analyses, high level, fairly abstract visual analyses, but not conceptual ones. The little triangles that are socially interacting, not in our data, that does not activate the FFA, activates the STS, other interesting social regions, not the ventral pathway. So that's just underlining what you're saying, Marina. If those really are perceptual regions in sighted subjects, and your evidence suggests that they're doing kind of higher level things in blind people, then what, if anything, is in common across those?
I'm not sure I fully understand that, to be honest. So I don't know, you reconcile that to the proposition that actually when you touch face, you activate the same higher level kind of stuff you do when you see face, right? So what is this higher level stuff? If it's just perceptual processing, as you just suggest.
Do you mean in sighted subjects or in blind subjects? I mean, I think
in blind subject, I mean, if there is still this relationship, right? Because I to go back to Marina, I don't think the goal is to merge these things, right? To kind of abolish this functional segregation in blind and then therefore in sighted people. I think that still there's pretty kind of, well, not say trivial, but if it activates more for a face than for a tactile face, than for a tactile house, than for a tactile tool, or more for a voice than the sound of a bird or the sound of an object. These things share attention, memory, share lots of stuff, right? But they have some specific stuff in that are different, right? So this is why, therefore, they elicit some preferential activity, right? So what are these stuff, right?
Okay,
what is this stuff if it's not abstract?
Well, let's lay out some hypotheses. One hypothesis is that it's an amodal representation of shape, right? So that would account for, visual.
Sorry to interrupt, but then therefore you should have observed the difference between your cube and your ball.
Maybe, depends what you mean by shape. Right? That's one kind of shape feature, but you might have some 3D, 2.5D representation of the surface structure of the thing that would generalize between vision and touch. Now it's a challenge to go from there to auditory, but maybe Ilker would argue, I know that Tenenbaum has occasionally argued that you might have a model of the physical head, and that would both enable you to have a representation of the visual properties of its shape, the tactile properties of its shape, and the sounds it could produce. That strikes me as slightly far-fetched, but interesting. I would count all of that as still high-level perceptual on that count. Those things to me are really different than things like, what is this person thinking, or what is their goal? And that kind of stuff I don't think is represented in the ventral pathway in sighted subjects, but maybe, pending more information, maybe it is in blind subjects, and that would be a pretty different kind of set of processes, I think.
Yeah, totally agree. And then therefore, this is a clear prediction. This is not about merging things, right? Because you can make this clear prediction. If I understand correctly, Marina, she will predict that actually in blind people, this is the stuff they compute there, right? This is this kind of social, but cannot be, right? Because you have the theory of mind paper that do not elicit FFA activity in blind people, right, Marina?
Yes, I don't think it's particularly theory of mind, but I also think there's like a whole panoply of social representations. I think there are potentially more basic ones like representations of emotion that we haven't looked at. Liz, are you still going to are you giving a summary still at some point?
Yeah, I have some slides where we talk about that Fairhall paper and also like Marina, yours and my idea for a potential verbal emotional experiment. So I can present those slides whenever we like.
Yeah, so I won't say too much about it, but just to say, like, I think there's still lots of possibilities on the table. I don't think it's necessarily mental state representations per se. But I also, I guess, want to get back to your anterior posterior issue that some people have mentioned. So this may, I think this is an interesting thought, right? So we say things like VWFA, PPA, and FFA, but even across these, there may be differences across these regions, but also, particularly, I think in the case of the VWFA and in the case of the PPA, there seems to be some evidence for a stream rather than for like a punctured area with potentially different representations within a sighted person. And it's possible, I think, that in people who are blind, these representations expand backwards. And so what happens is, those portions are maintained, but the perceptual portions are not. That would be one thing, one possible hypothesis. I actually don't know in the case of FFA, not aware of any evidence that there are like more anterior portions that do something else, but in the case of the VWFA and the PPA, but I don't know, Nancy.
Yeah, I think up in the temporal pole, there's a bunch of people who study those regions and they're clearly quite different, probably cross-modal to voice and all of that. I don't see those things well enough that I could ever figure out how to study them, but lots of other people soldier on and make claims about them. I don't know how they get any activations there. We don't get activations in any more than half of subjects, so I don't know what's up there. But
I'm certain that the other models, like with macaque, that's very clear, right? That's just not a lump of thing, but there's a lot of structure. I also like, not to make matters more complicated, but someone has to raise that. I mean, we like to talk about perception, perceptual analysis. It is not all that obvious what counts as perception. I don't think that has much of any implication in terms of lumping or segregating things. But thinking, I mean, I find it easier to think in terms of not in terms of spontaneous processing. Like, what are the things that we spontaneously process when we are presented with, let's say, image of a face, in the absence of any explicit task? So if you, and under brief exposure. So if you show me image of a face for 150 milliseconds, for 200 milliseconds, what are the things that are just spontaneously computed in the mind? And that seems to be a broad category, right? Like, if you go to Alex Todorov, you will hear things about trustworthiness, like really this high level social concepts. And if you go to Brian Shaw, also thinks race is part, or this social like social elements that we think of higher level abstract, they seem to be part of social perception. So I don't think many people in this like would argue that perception is not like those don't belong to perception, but it is quite possible that they are not processed along the same brain hierarchy as as it is like they may be at different stages than FFA, but certainly they are part of spontaneous processing. So they don't, a lot of those things don't require explicit thinking or reasoning, and I think that imposes important computational constraints. And it might also have implications in terms of plasticity. That if those things are things that you want to compute, no matter what, like spontaneously, inclined doing so, that might impact what you learn of the world.
Yeah, Ilker, I think that's an interesting idea. I guess I would suggest, my inclination is that what is spontaneously computed is not a natural class. It is because it could depend on what you say to the participant before the scan, or what they did yesterday, or like all sorts of factors that could change it.
What is not dependent on those things, right? Like,
I think that we as like psychologists and cognitive scientists and neuroscientists could try to define levels of hierarchical processing, both cognitively and neurally, that have particular representational content and particular behavioral roles, right? So, right, yeah. So I think those could be natural kinds, but I think this is related, for example, to the variability that Ratan and Nancy were discussing, and the difference between what happens in a monkey versus a human who has never seen a face, but then sees one, right? I think different people could think different things, depending on the context, depending on what, and different species will have different top-down influences. So that's what I would say, like, it's still interesting to think about like what's processed spontaneously, but I think it's possible for someone to spontaneously engage in theory of mind reasoning. It's not very likely, but it's possible for some people.
I mean, I totally agree, Marina, but a lot, these things, I think the category of things that are spontaneously processed is very much amenable to empirical study. Like, you can take a data-driven approach to think about what are the things, early processing cares about. There are methods, you can do, objective measure, change detection and all that. And you will reveal that. I feel like that's a category that is, more data-driven, takes out, and I don't think it is, all that malleable. Like and in fact, part of it might be situated in the developmental trajectory as well as evolutionary background. You want to care about face identity, you want to care about the body posture, you want to care about trustworthiness of others and all that. So it may not be all that willy-nilly, and I think can be studied quite empirically in a systematic manner. But I will add the caveat that I am not sure how much of that, had bearing in terms of talking about the neural hardware that it maps onto.
Liz, do you want to do your thing? Because maybe, it would be useful to hear what you have to say. And then if we have more time at the end, we can continue talking.
Sure. Okay, that's a good idea. Okay, let me just share my screen. Okay. Can we see my slides?
Yep.
Okay. Oh, and this box, I'll get rid of that. I'm going to skip a bunch of these slides, I think, because I don't think we need to rehash a lot of these things. I guess one thing, when Marina and I have talked about an idea for an experiment, and it really gets to trying to tease apart the effect of verbal processing, emotional processing, more face-specific stimuli. But the idea is really based on the premise that in sighted people, the area of the FFA is primarily a perceptual area, in line with what Nancy just said. So I guess I ask people to consider it in that context. If people want to reject that premise, then that's okay as well, but just that's where these ideas have come from. I guess one thing that Marina and I have mentioned but not gone into any detail about is there is other neuroimaging evidence of a FFA-like area in blindness from Fairhall et al. And they looked at this area and tested a very different hypothesis about what might be happening here, and that they weren't testing anything face-specific. They were looking at verbal and non-verbal emotional stimuli, and also testing to the degree to which these stimuli activated FFA-like areas in congenitally blind and sighted groups. So they had auditory verbal stimuli that varied in emotional valence. So they had happy, disgust, fear, neutral conditions within the verbal. They also had non-verbal vocalizations that also varied along those same emotional content conditions. And they varied speaker identity. And so in some trials, they had participants attend to the emotional content, and they did a one-back task to match the emotional content. And in other trials, they had participants attend to speaker identity. And here's the sort of key results. So they localized the FFA using an independent sighted group, I believe, using visual faces versus places. And in this region, they find this big effect of, well, they find obviously a difference between the groups and this interaction. So they have much greater responses to both verbal and non-verbal vocal stimuli in the blind group compared to the sighted. They have this larger effect for verbal over non-verbal vocal stimuli. And they also did multivoxel pattern analysis to try to decode, and they could decode emotional content in this FFA ROI in the blind group, but not speaker identity. So, I mean, that this speaks to a couple of these potential hypotheses that we've talked about, what, something that might be happening in a blind FFA, and that it might be more, that might be domain related. Interestingly, the speaker identity was not decodable, which I guess this is starting to try to separate these broader things that we've been talking about that might be a socially relevant thing. And this is sort of what Ilker, I think, was talking about. When we see a face, we don't only see a face. We also know the person and know their age and attractiveness, and we can hear their voice. But in terms of what the FFA actually does, this is what we're really talking about in this experiment that I'm going to propose. My next slides are, I can probably skip through them. Essentially, this is some data. I won't go into it because we're running out of time, and I'd rather hear feedback on our experiment. But these are some unpublished data from Lisa in our lab, basically showing that sighted people vastly overestimate the degree to which blind people touch other people's faces to identify them. I have a feeling it's happened in a movie, and then sighted people just decided this is something blind people do, but it's actually not. And again, this is it's a similar question. How well would a blind person identify a friend, mother, parent, or romantic partner? The answer is they don't really do this. And here's some empirical data showing that congenitally blind people are in fact worse at identifying faces haptically in terms of face identities, not knowing that it's a face. So this is just a bit of information that Marina and I have thought about in considering the possibilities of what could be happening in a blind FFA. So I'm going to skip this. Here is we have an idea for an experiment. So I'll just explain the different conditions and then leave it at that, and then we can get some feedback from the panel members and any audience members. So essentially, we thought we could have congenitally blind and sighted groups. We could localize what might be closest to a blind FFA in that using Ratan's haptic stimuli. So in this sense, we would localize the areas that care most about the perceptual features of a face that blind people can access haptically. In sighted people, we could localize visually. We would have auditory stimuli. We would have verbal stimuli that had emotional content. So we thought we could just do positive and negative. Also a neutral condition. Also, we thought we could have a facial description condition in the logic that if this region does really care about these perceptual features, then descriptions of those particular facial features could be elicit particular activation here. We could tease apart verbal and non-verbal responses by also having, like in the Fairhall study, non-verbal vocal or just face-related sounds, any sounds that come from a face. And again, within this condition, we could vary the emotional content and have positive and negative valence and also neutral. We thought we could also have sounds that come from a person, but not necessarily a face. So for example, footsteps, to see if it's face-related sounds versus people sounds. And as a control condition, something inanimate, perhaps scene sounds. So, I mean, I can go through the prediction. I've basically explained the sort of predictions that we could make if it is about facial particular perceptual features in this localized area. Then we might see a stronger effect of this facial description language. If it's really about verbal, then we could get stronger verbal over non-verbal sounds, regardless of emotional content. I think that's unlikely. I think we'd get, based on the Fairhall study, we would get a finding of emotional valence. I think I forgot to say, in the Fairhall study, they showed stronger effects for verbal over non-verbal, but they argued, I believe, that could be due to the fact that verbal information is more strongly capable of conveying emotion than non-verbal. So that, I mean, that remains to be tested. I don't think they actually showed decoding of emotion. Or maybe they did show it separately in verbal and non-verbal. I can't remember. But in any case, this is in a nutshell, and I'm trying to be brief, the idea that we have come up with. So I'd love to hear any feedback from the audience or panel members about this idea or any further ideas.
Yeah, this is, I think, a very, very lovely idea, I think. I can just share one slide.
Sure. Maybe I'll just put this presenter view. Sorry, I'm having trouble seeing the Zoom screen, so I can hear you. Which
I think
slide?
when I try to share my slide, it says that you should probably unshare yours.
Oh,
first.
you want to share a slide? Sorry. There you go. Sorry, Olivier.
No problem. Let's see if I can do that. Here. It's just for food for thought, right? So So this is the one I want to share. Do you see some brains?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, here, and red and blue. Yeah,
Yeah.
two lines of brains. Yeah. So actually in Stefania's experiment, we did not really insist on that, but we looked at it out of curiosity. We did not know what to do with that. So we never reported that, but somehow it has part of the stuff you were interested in somehow. So here above, like again, we don't see it well, but here somewhere here it's outlined where is the FFA in sighted people, right? So you recognize the place. And this is again the winner-take-all, the voxels in red here that prefer voices over other type of sounds, right? So we again see this overlap. But here what we do is that we separate, because we have two types of vocalization, not a lot, really, admittedly. Correct me if I'm wrong, Stefania, but I think we have 3 sounds that were neutral, and 3 sounds that were emotional. That at the end we merged together for the analysis Stefania showed you, but it's not a lot of data. Am I correct, Stefania, if you can jump in?
It is correct.
Yeah, and so here we separate these two just in this approach, right? And what we see, and I don't know if it's interesting or not, but it's indeed that in sighted people, you have activity only for vocalization, but not for emotion, actually, right? So you see red, but you don't see yellow, right? So it does not seem to have some kind of selectivity for emotion. It's more for vocalization, neutral vocalization. In blind people, again, I mean, it's super preliminary stuff, right? So it's not a lot of data, but it seems maybe that there are 2 clusters, that there are some parts that prefer emotional sounds and some parts that prefer neutral sounds.
Interesting.
Can I ask a question? Are those each contrasts with some kind of baseline, or did you contrast them directly to each other?
It's like winner take all. So if the voxels show up here, it means that it's higher activity for those categories compared to all the other categories. So meaning places, object, birds.
Average together, not each, not the sum of.
Yes, each, not average together, each. It needs to be higher than each of them. It does not, again, it's a winner take all, right? We do not do t-stats and we do not need significance at each voxels for this to show up, right? Because actually we don't do our stats on that, right? Stefania showed that we do our stats on the topographical distribution of these things. So again,
you could do stats. You could directly contrast these and say,
yes. So yes, admittedly, if we do that, obviously, if we use stringent statistical comparison, this will wash out. This is if anything, this is not super robust in a sense of like phase versus place, right? But we are speaking about sounds in the occipital cortex of sighted people, right? So but this is interesting. At least what we see is that it's not random, right? It cannot be random.
Can I, Stefania, do you know off the top of your head, I'm just curious what these sounds were and which ones are emotional and which ones are not?
So for the vocalization sound, we had sounds like ah or ba ba ba. Really. And for the emotion, there was a laughing voice similar to the one Ratan showed in his presentation. Then we had the person crying. And the third one was the person yawning. So it was not maybe with a strong emotional valence. But yeah, as Olivier said, they are very preliminary, and that's also why we didn't really use them. But I think it was interesting to check and to see that, I mean, there are these 2 big clusters in blind, and maybe this can bring to something interesting if we go.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
And one thing we were thinking when thinking about this stuff, right, that relates to what you presented, one thing that is a little bit tricky, such experiment, is to control for the engagement people do with these stimuli. So what I mean by that is that you might well observe that in TVA, so the temporal voice area, the region that is selective for voice, the prediction that it will react more to verbal voice than to nonverbal voice, and more to emotional voice than to neutral voice. Already there, right? So I don't know what does that tell us, but if you were to observe that in FFA, you observe this kind of, I mean, obviously, if you observe it only in blind and not in sighted, this tells us something. But if you observe differences there, it's probably only interesting if you have kind of a double dissociation somewhere else, right? If that this kind of stimuli does not elicit necessarily this kind of hierarchical relationship in any voice selective regions you see. And it might well be the case because they are, obviously, if you hear something saying something with an emotional voice, it's much more interesting than hearing right? And so maybe, I don't know how to control for that. It's a little bit tricky, but and I don't know how much it can be a problem, right? But again, if you were to use maybe a more multivariate approach, and I don't know if we want to go there, but maybe you could see that something a little bit more like along and the more like feature related stuff, right? So where you will have all the neutral sounds that elicit the same distributed activation, all the, I don't know if it solves necessarily the problem though, but.
Or just give a difficult task and make it, if anything, more difficult for the neutral than the emotionally expressed.
Yeah.
For example, the Van der Herk study used something like comparing so every stimulus with the previous stimulus on a scale of conceptual similarity. And that is like whatever the participant imagines is conceptual similarity. So what they were doing is just comparing the current sound with the previous sound. And you can immediately tell, I mean, the task is actually quite challenging for the participants, and they are certainly very, very engaged because they need to make a response for every single stimulus.
Mm-hmm. And just a point that also I wanted to make, and before I forget, I tend to forget stuff also, and I'm kind of afraid to say that in front of Nancy, but also I'm not sure how much we know that FFA is for identity itself, right? Because you seem to assume that in sighted people, FFA is for identity, but are we sure about that?
I don't, if I gave that impression, I apologize. I don't believe that to be true. I think it's a very perceptual area that cares about these perceptual features, but I don't think it's known that it codes identity per se. Nancy?
I mean, it is pretty annoying that we haven't nailed that. I mean, it's certainly a good guess, and there's some shreds of evidence. The MVPA decoding is pathetic. A few studies find, you know, a hair above chance, barely significant, not impressive. We did an adaptation study way back, me and Galit Yovel. We showed identity-specific adaptation for upright, not inverted faces. Those are also tiny effect sizes, but it was highly significant. That's some evidence. But I would say the strongest evidence is just what happens when people have lesions there. This was known before we ever reported the FFA, but you can, if you look at the ones where the lesions are pretty close, they have no trouble knowing that a face is a face. They can detect faces just fine. They just don't know who that face is. And so those are the reasons to suspect that it's probably, and also monkey face patches, which are probably homologous, like ML, which is the best guess. You can readily decode face identity when you can actually see the neural code because you have electrodes. So those are all the reasons to think that it's probably doing something like face identity discrimination, but I don't think it's nailed.
Yeah, but because it raised this problem, we thought about that with voice. The problem, and I think it's the same with faces, right? Is that obviously to identify someone, you have to link the physical features to the memory of knowing this person and all the context about it, right? And in typical experiments, obviously, if you just were to present different voices and some of them will reoccur, right? But you don't know this person. Obviously, it's not that you will, I mean, it's difficult to conceive it as identity, even if it's, you know, you will have someone say different words in different emotional tone and these things and different speakers, right? So let's say you do a factorial design. I think that it will be very clear for everyone what is the emotion, what is the word, right? What do they mean? What is the emotion, categorical emotion displayed? But for the identity of people, it will be I mean,
Right, it
pretty
seems to me like,
irrelevant.
I don't know, probably somebody's done this and I just don't know the whole literature, but it seems to me you could totally do that. Either use familiar voices, which would have the problem that people will mentally image their face visually, but or unfamiliar ones. If you give them enough experience, right? You know, you can have voices are very evocative. I mean, in the same way that faces are. You know, Ilker's thing shows just a little piece of that. But yeah, I think you could absolutely ask about decoding of voice identity, and I don't.
Yes, definitely. So your point is totally right. Yes, I think what I wanted to say is that probably we will need to either train them, but I think maybe better is to play with familiar voices, which I think might be a little bit more tricky than for faces.
Just to pick up on that line of thought, you know, in the design of the experiment Liz was showing, and that's very exciting. I wonder if there's a, you know, manipulation that would, as a proxy, tap on identity. Like imagine, you know, in some of those audio clips, you present two people, like two unfamiliar people, just by having them, you know, talk just a little bit, maybe as part of a conversation. And then to think about, can I decode the number of individuals involved in a given stimuli? Like, you know, you would have to control for, you know, certain low-level patterns of discriminability in terms of one talker, two talkers, three talkers, sequences. But that could be interesting to think about FFA doing this scene configuration in terms of, you know, doing a little bit of a source localization, like, you know, initializing these heads in the scene. And just one more thing, you know, in that related vein, is I wonder if you guys would find it interesting to present through, you know, stereo headphones, viewpoints, but in the audio signal. So the person talking frontal, you know, sideways and all that, and to see to what extent that's, you know, part of FFA. Again, try to, you know, derive the system as richly as possible in terms of the, you know, world state that we can think of.
Interesting. We can definitely do that with binaural recording, right? So we can localize people in space, at least easily on the horizontal axis. Vertical is more complex, but I don't think we would need that.
Yeah.
I just want to say briefly, since we're going to have to, at least I have to stop sometime soon. I like the idea for the experiment. I think it's great. And I think what would be really nice is if you could fit as much of that as possible within subjects, which would probably require multiple sessions per subject. Because all the, you know, it's, you know, as you guys know well, you can't just take a group FFA and say it's the same thing. Who the hell knows, right? And so if you could really ask whether, you know, so Ratan's study and already shows that the bit that responds selectively to tactile faces also responds selectively to audio faces, but we don't know if that's the same as a bit that responds more to language than non-language, et cetera. So I think it'll be very useful, and we know nothing about whether it responds to emotions. My understanding of the Fairhall study is all the stimuli had emotional content, so you can't tell with the nice, you know, univariate signal whether it's, you know, selective.
I tend to remember that also, that there was like this problem with this study. Yeah,
there was a neutral condition, but they didn't, it was just sort of lumped in as one of the emotional conditions. They didn't have enough power to, or didn't report emotional versus non-emotional.
Yeah, I think that's definitely an important goal of this. And in some ways we do that because we don't have enough participants to do these, like, we don't want to do the group things, nor do we have enough people to do them.
Great, good.
Yeah, one of the things that Liz, I can't remember if she mentioned, is that all, you know, at some point we did this giant scan-a-thon where we brought every person back that we could for every task that we've ever done. So all of the people that we've scanned have all the higher cognitive experiments. We haven't published that like mother load yet altogether, but the hope is that like we already have all their activations, so we'll be able to line up the responses to faces and places and whatever else we can do with all the other stuff in each person, which would be great. Lots of work to do. All right, it seems like we're out of time, huh?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you so much, everybody. This was so great. It was really
This was fun.
enjoyable.
Thanks so much for organizing it.
Super.
My
Yeah.
pleasure.
Yeah,
Absolute
Thank you very
pleasure.
much.
hearing from everyone. Really, really interesting.
Yeah, this is exactly what we're trying to promote. I want to thank you guys all for, setting this up, and hopefully the future collaboration and exciting research that we'll get to see. We definitely hope that that's excited you guys as well as everybody who joined us for the last couple of hours. And for those in the audience, feel free to get in touch with this group if you have further suggestions, insights, or an interest in participating. And I'm just going to close by briefly reminding you that we have some more events coming up in CCN this year. So first, thank you all for participating in today's event. And we are going to have the progress report from all of the generative adversarial collaborations on the 16th. And then we have 3 more on the 17th, 23rd, and the 1st from this year's crop of general adversarial collaborations. We also have the keynote and tutorials, voxel-wise modeling on the 13th, controversial stimuli on the 14th, and identification of population dynamics on the 24th. And we do hope you will consider joining us for all of these. So with that, I would like to thank everybody for your time and attention today, and we'll see you next time.